The Black Dog, A Night of Spectral Terror by Stephen Crane. This is a LibriVox recording. Maine. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothman. The Black Dog by Stephen Crane. There was a ceaseless rumble in the air as the heavy raindrops battered upon the laurel thickets and the matted moss and haggard rocks beneath. 4 water-soaked men made their difficult way through the drenched forest. The little man stopped and shook an angry finger at where night was stealthily following them. "Cursed be fate and her children and her children's children! We are everlastingly lost!" he cried. The panting procession halted under some dripping, drooping hemlocks, and swore with wrathful astonishment. "It will rain for 40 days and 40 nights," said the pudgy man moaningly, "and I feel like a wet loaf of bread now. We shall never find our way out of this wilderness until I am made into a porridge." In desperation, they started again to drag their listless bodies through the watery bushes. After a time, the clouds withdrew from above them, and great winds came from concealment and went sweeping and swirling among the trees. Night also came very near and menaced the wanderers with darkness. The little man had determination in his legs. He scrambled among the thickets and made desperate attempts to find a path or road. As he climbed a hillock, he espied a small clearing upon which sat desolation and a venerable house, wept over by wind-waved pines. "Ho!" he cried. "It's a house!" His companions staggered painfully after him as he fought the thickets between him and the cabin. At their approach, the wind frenziedly opposed them and skirled madly in the trees. The little man boldly confronted the weird glances from the crannies of the cabin and rapped on the door. A score of timbers answered with groans, and, within, something fell on the floor with a clang. "Ho!" said the little man. He stepped back a few paces. Somebody in a distant part started and walked across the floor towards the door with an ominous step. A slate-colored man appeared. He was dressed in a ragged shirt and trousers, the latter stuffed into his boots. Large tears were falling from his eyes. "How do do, my friends?" said the little man affably. "My old Uncle Jim Crocker, he's sick to death," replied the slate-colored person. "Ho!" said the little man. "Is that so?" The latter's clothing clung desperately to him, and water sogged in his boots. He stood patiently on one foot for a time. "Can you put us up here till tomorrow?" he asked finally. "Yes," said the slate-colored man. The party passed into the little unwashed room, inhabited by a stove, a stairway, a few precarious chairs, and a misshapen table. "I'll fry yer up some pork and make you some coffee," said the slate-colored man to his guests. "Go ahead, old boy," cried the little man cheerfully, from where he sat on the table smoking his pipe and dangling his legs. "My old Uncle, Jim Crocker, he's sick to death," said the slate-colored man. "Think he'll die?" asked the pudgy man gently. "No, he won't die. He's an old man, but he won't die yet. The Black Dog hasn't been around yet." "The Black Dog?" said the little man feebly. He struggled with himself for a moment. "What's the Black Dog?" he asked at last. "He's a spirit," said the slate-colored man in a voice of somber hue. "Oh, he is? Well, he haunts these parts, he does, and when people are going to die, he comes and sets and howls." "Ho!" said the little man. He looked out of the window and saw night making a million shadows. The little man moved his legs nervously. "I don't believe in these things," he said, addressing the slate-colored man, who was scuffling with a side of pork. "What things?" came incoherently from the combatant. "Oh, these, phantoms and ghosts and whatnot. All rot, I say." "That's because you have merely a stomach and no soul," grunted the pudgy man. "Ho, old Pudgkins," replied the little man, his back curved with passion. A tempest of wrath was in the pudgy man's eyes. The final epithet used by the little man was a carefully studied insult, always brought forth at a crisis. They quarreled. "All right, Pudgkins, bring on your phantom," cried the little man in conclusion. His stout companion's wrath was too huge for words. The little man smiled triumphantly. He had staked his opponent's reputation. The visitors sat silent. The slate-colored man moved about in a small personal atmosphere of gloom. Suddenly a strange cry came to their ears from somewhere. It was a low, trembling call which made the little man quake privately in his shoes. The slate-colored man bounded at the stairway and disappeared with a flash of legs through a hole in the ceiling. The party below heard two voices in conversation. One belonged to the slate-colored man, and the other in quavering tones of age. Directly, the slate-colored man reappeared from above and said, "The old man has took bad for his supper." He hurriedly prepared a mixture of hot water, salt, and beef. Beef tea, it might be called. He disappeared again. Once more the party below heard, vaguely, talking over their heads. The voice of age arose to a shriek. "Open the window, fool! Do you think I can live in the smell of your soup?" Mutterings by the slate-colored man and the creaking of the window were heard. The slate-colored man stumbled down the stairs and said with intense gloom, "The black dog'll be along soon." The little man started, and the pudgy man sneered at him. They ate a supper, and then sat waiting. The pudgy man listened so palpably that the little man wished to kill him. The wood fire became excited and sputtered frantically. Without, 1,000 spirits of the wind had become entangled in the pine branches, and were lowly pleading to be loosened. The slate-colored man tiptoed across the room and lit a timid candle. The men sat waiting. The phantom dog lay cuddled to a round bundle, asleep down the roadway, against the windward side of an old shanty. The specter's master had moved to Pike County, but the dog lingered as a friend might linger at the tomb of an old friend. His fur was like a suit of old clothes. His jowls hung and flopped, exposing his teeth. Yellow famine was in his eyes. The wind-rocked shanty groaned and muttered, but the dog slept. Suddenly, however, he got up and scrambled to the roadway. He cast a long glance from his hungry, despairing eyes in the direction of the venerable house. The breeze came full to his nostrils. He threw back his head and gave a long, low howl, and started intently up the road. Maybe he smelled a dead man. The group around the fire in the venerable house were listening and waiting. The atmosphere of the room was tense, and the slate-colored man's face was twitching, and his drab hands were gripped together. The little man was continually looking behind his chair. Upon the countenance of the pudgy man appeared conceit for an approaching triumph over the little man, mingled with apprehension for his own safety. 5 pipes glowed as rivals to the timid candle. Profound silence drooped heavily over them. Finally, the slate-colored man spoke. "My old Uncle Jim Crocker, he's sick to death." The 4 men started, and then shrank back in their chairs. "Damn it," replied the little man vaguely. Again there was a long silence. Suddenly It was broken by a wild cry from the room above. It was a shriek that struck upon them with appalling swiftness, like a flash of lightning. The walls whirled, and the floor rumbled. It brought the men together with a rush. They huddled in a heap and stared at the white terror in each other's faces. The slate-colored man grasped the candle and flared it above his head. "The black dog!" he howled, and plunged at the stairway. The maddened four men followed frantically, for it was better to be in the presence of the awful than only within hearing. Their ears still quivered with the shriek. They bound through the hole in the ceiling and into the sick room. With quilts drawn closely to his shrunken breast for a shield, his bony hand gripping the cover, an old man lay with glazed eyes fixed on the open window. His throat gurgled, and a froth appeared at his mouth. From the outer darkness came a strange, unnatural wail, burdened with the weight of death and every note filled with foreboding. It was the song of the spectral dog. "God!" screamed the little man. He ran to the open window. He could see nothing at first save the pine trees, engaged in a furious combat, tossing back and forth and struggling. The moon was peeping cautiously over the rims of some black clouds. But the chant of the phantom guided the little man's eyes, and he at length perceived its shadowy form on the ground under the window. He fell away gasping at the sight. The pudgy man crouched in the corner, chattering insanely. The slate-colored man, in his fear, crooked his legs and looked like a hideous Chinese idol. The man upon the bed was turned to stone, save the froth, which pulsated. In the final struggle, terror will fight the inevitable. The little man roared maniacal curses and rushed again to the window, began to throw various articles at the spectre. A mug, a plate, a knife, a fork, all crashed or clanged on the ground, but the song of the spectre continued. The bowl of beef tea followed. As it struck the ground, the phantom ceased its cry. The men in the chamber sank limply against the walls, with the unearthly wail still ringing in their ears, and the fear unfaded from their eyes. They waited again. The little man felt his nerves vibrate. Destruction was better than another wait. He grasped a candle and, going to the window, held it over his head and looked out. "Ho!" he said. His companions crawled to the window and peered out with him. "He's eating the beef tea," said the slate-colored man faintly. "The damn dog was hungry," said the pudgy man. "There's your phantom," said the little man to the pudgy man. On the bed the old man lay dead. Without, the spectre was wagging its tail. The end of The Black Dog, by Stephen Crane.
By Word of Mouth, by Rudyard Kipling. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Newgate Novelist. By Word of Mouth, by Rudyard Kipling. Not though you die tonight, oh sweet and wail, a spectre at my door, shall mortal fear make love immortal fail. I shall but love you more, who, from death's arms returning, give me still one moment's comfort in my matchless ill. Shadow Houses. This tale may be explained by those who know how souls are made, and where the bounds of the possible are put down. I have lived long enough in this country to know that it is best to know nothing, and can only write the story as it happened. Dumoise was our civil surgeon at Meridki, and we called him Dormouse, because he was a round little, sleepy little man. He was a good doctor, and never quarrelled with anyone, not even with the deputy commissioner, who had the manners of a bargee and the tact of a horse. He married a girl as round and as sleepy-looking as himself. She was a Miss Hillardyce, daughter of Squash Hillardyce of the Burrars, who married his chief's daughter by mistake, but that is another story. A honeymoon in India is seldom more than a week long, but there is nothing to hinder a couple from extending it over 2 or 3 years. This is a delightful country for married folk who are wrapped up in one another. They can live absolutely alone and without interruption, just as the dormice did. Those 2 little people retired from the world after their marriage, and were very happy. They were forced, of course, to give occasional dinners, but they made no friends hereby, and the station went its own way and forgot them, only saying, occasionally, that Dormouse was the best of good fellows, though dull. A civil surgeon who never quarrels is a rarity, and appreciated as such. Few people can afford to play Robinson Crusoe anywhere, least of all in India, where we are few in the land, and very much dependent on each other's kind offices. Dumoise was wrong in shutting himself from the world for a year, and he discovered his mistake when an epidemic of typhoid broke out in the station in the heart of the cold weather, and his wife went down. He was a shy little man, and 5 days were wasted before he realized that Mrs. Dumoise was burning with something worse than simple fever, and 3 days more passed before he ventured to call on Mrs. Shute, the engineer's wife, and timidly speak about his trouble. Nearly every household in India knows that doctors are very helpless in typhoid. The battle must be fought out between death and the nurses, minute by minute and degree by degree. Mrs. Shute almost boxed Dumoise's ears for what she called his criminal delay, and went off at once to look after the poor girl. We had 7 cases of typhoid in the station that winter, and, as the average of death is about 1 in every 5 cases, we felt certain that we should have to lose somebody. But all did their best. The women sat up nursing the women, and the men turned to and tended the bachelors who were down, and we wrestled with those typhoid cases for 52 days, and brought them through the valley of the shadow in triumph. But, just when we thought all was over, and were going to give a Cinderella to celebrate the victory, little Mrs. Dumoise got a relapse, and died in 3 days, and the station went to the funeral. Dumoise broke down utterly at the brink of the grave, and had to be taken away. After the death, Dumoise crept into his own house, and refused to be comforted. He did his duties perfectly, but we all felt that he should go on leave, and the other men in his own service told him so. Dumoise was very thankful for this suggestion. He was thankful for anything in those days, and went to Chini on a walking tour. Chini is some 20 marches from Simla, in the heart of the hills, and the scenery is good if you are in trouble. You pass through big, still deodar forests, and under big, still cliffs, and over big, still grass downs swelling like a woman's breast, and the wind across the grass and the rain among the deodars says, "Hush, hush, hush." So little Dumoise was packed off to Chini, to wear down his grief with a full-plate camera and a rifle. He took also a useless Purbeer bearer, because the man had been his wife's favourite servant. That bearer was idle and a thief, but Dumoise trusted everything implicitly to him. On his way back from Chini, Dumoise turned aside to Boggy through the forest reserve which is on the spur of Mount Hutu. Some men who have travelled more than a little say that the march from Kotgar to Bagi is one of the finest in creation. It runs through dark wet forest, and ends suddenly in bleak, nipped hillside and black rocks. Bagi Dock Bungalow is open to all the winds and is bitterly cold. Few people go to Bagi. Perhaps that was the reason why Dumoise went there. He halted at 7 in the evening, and his bearer went down the hillside to the village to engage coolies for the next day's march. The sun had set, and the night winds were beginning to sing among the rocks. Dumoise leaned on the railing of the veranda, waiting for his bearer to return. The man came back almost immediately after he had disappeared, and at such a rate that Dumoise fancied he must have crossed a bear. He was running as hard as he could up the face of the hill. But there was no bear to account for his terror. He raced to the veranda and fell down, the blood spurting from his nose and his face iron grey. Then he gurgled, "I have seen the Mem-Sahib! I have seen the Mem-Sahib!" "Where?" asked Dumoise. "Down there, walking on the road to the village. She was in a blue dress, and she lifted the purdah of her bonnet and said, 'Ram Das, give my salams to the Sahib and tell him that I shall meet him next month at Nudia.' Then I ran away, because I was afraid." What Dumoise said or did, I do not know. Ram Das declares that he said nothing, but walked up and down the veranda all the cold night, waiting for the Mem-Sahib to come up the hill, and stretching out his arms into the dark like a madman. But no Mem-Sahib came, and next day he went on to Simla, cross-questioning the bearer every hour. Ram Das could only say that he had met Mrs. Dumoise, and that she had lifted up her veil, and given him the message which he had faithfully repeated to Dumoise. To this statement Ram Das adhered. He did not know where Nudia was, had no friends at Nudia, and would most certainly never go to Nudia, even though his pay were doubled. Nudia is in Bengal, and has nothing whatever to do with a doctor serving in the Punjab. It must be more than 1,200 miles from Meridki. Dumoise went through Simla without halting, and returned to Meridki, there to take overcharge from the man who had been officiating for him during his tour. There were some dispensary accounts to be explained, and some recent orders of the Surgeon General to be noted, and, altogether, the taking over was a full day's work. In the evening, Dumoise told his locum tenens, who was an old friend of his bachelor days, what had happened at Bagi, and the man said that Ram Das might as well have chosen Tuticorin while he was about it. At that moment, a telegraph peon came in with a telegram from Simla, ordering Dumoise not to take overcharge at Meridki, but to go at once to Nudia on special duty. There was a nasty outbreak of cholera at Nudia, and the Bengal government, being short-handed, as usual, had borrowed a surgeon from the Punjab. Dumoise threw the telegram across the table and said, "Well?" The other doctor said nothing. It was all that he could say. Then he remembered that Dumoise had passed through Simla on his way from Bagi, and thus might, possibly, have heard first news of the impending transfer. He tried to put the question, and the implied suspicion into words, but Dumoise stopped him with, "If I had desired that, I should never have come back from Chini. I was shooting there. I wish to live, for I have things to do. But I shall not be sorry." The other man bowed his head, and helped, in the twilight, to pack up Dumoise's just-opened trunks. Ram Das entered with the lamps. "Where is the Sahib going?" he asked. "To Nudia," said Dumoise softly. Ramdas clawed Dumoise's knees and boots, and begged him not to go. Ramdas wept and howled till he was turned out of the room. Then he wrapped up all his belongings, and came back to ask for a character. He was not going to Nadir to see his Sob die, and, perhaps, to die himself. So Dumoise gave the man his chit, and went down to Nadir alone, the other doctor bidding him goodbye as one under sentence of death. 11 days later he had joined his Mem-Sahib, and the Bengal government had to borrow a fresh doctor to cope with that epidemic at Nadir. The first importation was dead at Chuadanga Dak Bungalow. End of By Word of Mouth by Rudyard Kipling.
The Call by Algernon Blackwood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Grzinski. The Call by Algernon Blackwood. The incident, story it never was perhaps, began tamely, almost meanly. It ended upon a note of strange unearthly wonder that has haunted him ever since. In Headley's memory, at any rate, it stands out as the loveliest, the most amazing thing he ever witnessed. Other emotions, too, contributed to the vividness of the picture. That he had felt jealousy towards his old pal Arthur Dean shocked him in the first place. It seemed impossible until it actually happened. But that the jealousy was proved afterwards to have been without a cause shocked him still more. He felt ashamed and miserable. For him, the actual incident began when he received a note from Mrs. Blondin asking him to the Priory for a weekend, or for longer if he could manage it. Captain Arthur Dean, she mentioned, was staying with her at the moment, and a warm welcome awaited him. Iris, she did not mention, Iris Manning, the interesting and beautiful girl for whom it was well known he had a considerable weakness. He found a good-sized house party. There was fishing in the little Sussex River, tennis, golf not far away, while 2 motor cars brought the remoter country across the downs into easy reach. Also, there was a bit of duck shooting for those who cared to wake at 3 a.m. and paddle upstream to the marshes where the birds were feeding. "Have you brought your gun?" was the first thing Arthur said to him when he arrived. "Like a fool, I left mine in town." "I hope you haven't," put in Miss Manning. "Because if you have, I must get up one fine morning at 3 o'clock. She laughed merrily, and there was an undernote of excitement in the laugh. Captain Headley showed his surprise. "That you were a Diana had escaped my notice, I'm ashamed to say," he replied lightly. "Yet I've known you some years, haven't I?" He looked straight at her, and the soft yet searching eye, turning from his friend, met his own securely. She was appraising him for the 100th time, and he, for the 100th time, was thinking how pretty she was, and wondering how long the prettiness would last after marriage. "I'm not," he heard her answer. "That's just it. But I've promised." "Rather," said Arthur gallantly, "and I shall hold you to it," he added, still more gallantly. Too gallantly, Headley thought. "I couldn't possibly get up at cock-crow without a very special inducement, could I now? You know me, Dick." "Well, anyhow, I've brought my gun," Headley replied evasively, "so you've no excuse, either of you. You'll have to go." And while they were laughing and chattering about it, Mrs. Blondin clinched the matter for them. Provisions were hard to come by. The larder really needed a brace or 2 of birds. It was the least they could do in return for what she called amusingly her armistice hospitality. "So I expect you to get up at 3, she chaffed them, "and return with your victory birds." It was from this preliminary skirmish over the tea-table on the loft 5 minutes after his arrival that Dick Headley realized easily enough the little game in progress. As a man of experience, just on the wrong side of 40, it was not difficult to see the cards each held. He sighed. Had he guessed an intrigue was on foot, he would not have come. Yet he might have known that wherever his hostess was, There where the vultures gathered together. Matchmaker by choice and instinct, Mrs. Blondin could not help herself. True to her name, she was always balancing on matrimonial tightropes for others. Her cards, at any rate, were obvious enough. She had laid them on the table for him. He easily read her hand. The next 24 hours confirmed his reading. Having made up her mind that Iris and Arthur were destined for each other, she had grown impatient. They had been 10 days together, yet Iris was still free. They were good friends only. With calculation, she, therefore, took a step that must bring things further. She invited Dick Headley, whose weakness for the girl was common knowledge. The card was indicated. She played it. Arthur must come to the point or see another man carry her off. This at least she planned, little dreaming that the dark king of spades would interfere. Miss Manning's hand also was fairly obvious, for both men were extremely eligible parties. She was getting on. One or other was to become her husband before the party broke up. This, in crude language, was certainly in her cards. Though being a nice and charming girl, she might camouflage it cleverly to herself and others. Her eyes on each man in turn, when the shooting expedition was being discussed, revealed her part in the little intrigue clearly enough. It was all, thus far, as commonplace as could be. But there were 2 more hands Headley had to read. His own and his friends', and these, he admitted honestly, were not so easy. To take his own first, it was true he was fond of the girl, and had often tried to make up his mind to ask her. Without being conceited, he had good reason to believe his affection was returned, and that she would accept him. There was no ecstatic love on either side, for he was no longer a boy of 20, nor was she unscathed by tempestuous love affairs that had scorched the first bloom from her face and heart. But they understood one another. They were an honest couple. She was tired of flirting. Both wanted to marry and settle down. Unless a better man turned up, she probably would say yes, without humbug or delay. It was this last reflection that brought him to the final hand he had to read. Here he was puzzled. Arthur Dean's role in the teacup strategy for the first time since they had known one another seemed strange, uncertain. Why? Because, though paying no attention to the girl openly, he met her clandestinely, unknown to the rest of the house party, and above all, without telling his intimate pal at 3 o'clock in the morning. The house party was in full swing, with a touch of that wild, reckless gaiety which followed the end of the war. "Let us be happy before a worse thing comes upon us," was in many hearts. After a crowded day, they danced till early in the morning, while doubtful weather prevented the early shooting expedition after dusk. The third night, Headley contrived to disappear early to bed. He lay there thinking. He was puzzled over his friend's role, over the clandestine meeting in particular. It was the morning before. Waking very early, he had been drawn to the window by an unusual sound, the cry of a bird. Was it a bird? In all his experience, he had never heard such a curious, half-singing call before. He listened a moment, thinking it must have been a dream. Yet, with the odd cry still ringing in his ears, it was repeated close beneath his open window, a long, low-pitched cry with 3 distinct following notes in it. He sat up in bed and listened hard. No bird that he knew could make such sounds, but it was not repeated a third time, and out of sheer curiosity he went to the window and looked out. Dawn was creeping over the distant downs. He saw their outline in the gray, pearly light. He saw the lawn below, stretching down to the little river at the bottom, where a curtain of faint mist hung in the air. And on this lawn he also saw Arthur Dean with Iris Manning. Of course, he reflected, they were going after the duck. He turned to look at his watch. It was 3 o'clock. The same glance, however, showed him his gun standing in the corner, so they were going without a gun. A sharp pang of unexpected jealousy shot through him. He was just going to shout out something or other, wishing them good luck, or asking if they had found another gun, perhaps, when a cold touch crept down his spine. The same instant his heart contracted. Dean had followed the girl into the summer house, which stood on the right. It was not the shooting expedition at all. Arthur was meeting her for another purpose. The blood flowed back, filling his head. He felt an eavesdropper, a sneak, a detective, but for all that, he felt also jealous, and his jealousy seemed chiefly because Arthur had not told him. Of this, then, he lay thinking in bed on the third night. The following day he had said nothing, but had crossed the corridor and put the gun in his friend's room. Arthur, for his part, had said nothing either. For the first time in their long, long friendship, there lay a secret between them. To Headley, the unexpected revelation came with pain. For something like a quarter of a century, these two had been bosom friends. They had camped together, been in the army together, taken their pleasure together, each the full confidant of the other, in all the things that go to make up men's lives. Above all, Headley had been the one and only recipient of Arthur's unhappy love story. He knew the girl, knew his friend's deep passion, and also knew his terrible pain when she was lost at sea. Arthur was burned out, finished, out of the running so far as marriage was concerned. He was not a man to love a second time. It was a great and poignant tragedy. Headley, as confidant, knew all. But more than that, Arthur, on his side, knew his friend's weakness for Iris Manning, knew that a marriage was still possible and likely between them. They were true as steel to one another, and each man, oddly enough, had once saved the other's life, thus adding to the strength of a great natural tie. Yet now one of them, feigning innocence by day, even indifference, secretly met his friend's girl by night, and kept the matter to himself. It seemed incredible. With his own eyes, Headley had seen him on the lawn, passing in the faint gray light through the mist into the summer house, where the girl had just preceded him. He had not seen her face, but he had seen the skirt sweep round the corner of the wooden pillar. He had not waited to see them come out again. So he now lay wondering what role his old friend was playing in this little intrigue that their hostess, Mrs. Blondin, helped to stage. And oddly enough, one minor detail stayed in his mind with a curious vividness. As naturalist, hunter, nature lover, the cry of that strange bird with its 3 mournful notes perplexed him exceedingly. A knock came at his door, and the door pushed open before he had time to answer. Dean himself came in. "Wise man," he exclaimed in an easy tone. "Got off to bed. Iris was asking where you were." He sat down on the edge of the mattress, where Headley was lying with a cigarette and an open book he had not read. The old sense of intimacy and comradeship rose in the latter's heart. Doubt and suspicion faded. He prized his great friendship. He met the familiar eyes. "Impossible," he said to himself. "Absolutely impossible. He's not playing a game. He's not a rotter." He pushed over his cigarette case, and Arthur lighted one. "Done in," he remarked shortly with the first puff. "Can't stand it any more. I'm off to town tomorrow." Headley stared in amazement. "Fed up already?" he asked. "Why, I rather like it. It's quite amusing. What's wrong, old man?" "This matchmaking," said Dean bluntly. "Always throwing that girl at my head. If it's not the duck shooting stunt at 3 a.m., it's something else. She doesn't care for me, and I don't care for her. Besides—" He stopped, and the expression of his face changed suddenly. A sad, quiet look of tender yearning came into his clear brown eyes. "You know, Dick," he went on in a low, half-reverent tone, "I don't want to marry. I never can." Dick's heart stirred within him. "Marry?" he said understandingly. The other nodded, as though the memories were still too much for him. "I'm still miserably lonely for her," he said. "Can't help it, simply. I feel utterly lost without her. Her memory to me is everything." He looked deep into his pal's eyes. "I'm married to that," he added very firmly. They pulled their cigarettes a moment in silence. They belonged to the male type that conceals emotion behind schoolboy language. "It's hard luck," said Headley gently. "Rotten luck, old man, I understand." Arthur's head nodded several times in succession as he smoked. He made no remark for some minutes. Then presently he said, as though it had no particular importance, for thus old friends show frankness to each other, "Besides, anyhow, It's you the girl's dying for, not me. She's blind as a bat, old Blondin. Even when I'm with her, thrust with her by that old matchmaker for my sins, it's you she talks about. All the talk leads up to you and yours. She's devilish fond of you." He paused a moment and looked searchingly into his friend's face. "I say, old man, do you mean business there? Because, excuse me interfering, but you'd better be careful. She's a good sort, you know, after all." "Yes, Arthur, I do like her a bit," Dick told him frankly, "but I can't make up my mind quite. You see, it's like this." And they talked the matter over as old friends will, until finally Arthur chucked his cigarette into the grate and got up to go. "Dead to the world," he said with a yawn. "I'm off to bed. Give you a chance, too," he added with a laugh. It was after midnight. The other turned as though something had suddenly occurred to him. "By the by, Arthur," he said abruptly, "what bird makes this sound?" He heard it the other morning. "Most extraordinary cry. You know everything that flies. What is it?" And to the best of his ability, he imitated the strange three-note cry he had heard in the dawn 2 mornings before. To his amazement and keen distress, his friend, with a sound like a stifled groan, sat down upon the bed without a word. He seemed startled. His face was white. He stared. He passed a hand as in pain across his forehead. "Do it again," he whispered in a hushed, nervous voice. "Once again. For me." And Headley, looking at him, repeated the queer notes, a sudden revulsion of feeling rising through him. "He's fooling me after all," ran in his heart. "My old pal." There was silence for a full minute. Then Arthur, stammering a bit, said lamely, a certain hush in his voice still, "Where in the world did you hear that? And when?" Dick Headley sat up in bed. He was not going to lose this friendship, which to him was more than the love of woman. He must help. His pal was in distress and difficulty. There were circumstances, he realized, that might be too strong for the best man in the world sometimes. No, by God, he would play the game and help him out. "Arthur, old chap," he said affectionately, almost tenderly, "I heard it 2 mornings ago, on the lawn below my window here. It woke me up. I went to look 3 in the morning about." Arthur amazed him then. He first took another cigarette and lit it steadily. He looked round the room vaguely, avoiding, it seemed, the other's eyes. Then he turned, pain in his face, and gazed straight at him. "You saw nothing?" he asked in a louder voice, but a voice that had something very real and true in it. It reminded Headley of the voice he heard when he was fainting from exhaustion and Arthur had said, "Take it, I tell you, I'm all right," and had passed over the flask. Though his own throat and sight and heart were black with thirst, it was a voice that had command in it, a voice that did not lie, because it could not, yet did lie and could lie when occasion warranted. Headley knew a second's awful struggle. "Nothing," he answered quietly after his little pause. "Why?" For perhaps 2 minutes his friend hid his face. Then he looked up. "Only," he whispered, "because that was our secret lover's cry. It seems so strange you heard it and not I. I felt her so close of late. Mary." The white face held very steady. The firm lips did not tremble, but it was evident that the heart knew anguish that was deep and poignant. "We used it to call each other in the old days. It was our private call. No one else in the world knew it but Mary and myself." Dick Headley was flabbergasted. He had no time to think, however. "It's odd you should hear it and not I," his friend repeated. He looked hurt, bewildered, wounded. Then suddenly his face brightened. "I know," he cried suddenly. "You and I are pretty good pals. There's a tie between us and all that. Why, it's telepathy, or whatever they call it. That's what it is." He got up abruptly. Dick could think of nothing to say but to repeat the other's words. Of course, that's it," he said. "Telepathy." He stared anywhere but at his pal. "Night-night," he heard from the door, and before he could do more than reply in similar vein, Arthur was gone. He lay for a long time, thinking. He found it all very strange. Arthur in this emotional state was new to him. He turned it over and over. Well, he had known good men behave queerly when wrought up. That recognition of the bird's cry was strange, of course, but he knew the cry of a bird when he heard it, though he might not know the actual bird. That was no human whistle. Arthur was inventing. No, that was not possible. He was worked up then, over something, a bit hysterical perhaps. It had happened before, though, in a milder way when his heart attacks came on. They affected his nerves and head a little, it seemed. He was a deep sort, Dick remembered. Thought turned and twisted in him, offering various solutions, some absurd, some likely. He was a nervous, high-strung fellow underneath, Arthur was. He remembered that. Also, he remembered, anxiously again, that his heart was not quite sound, though what that had to do with the present tangle he did not see. Yet it was hardly likely that he would bring in Mary as an invention, an excuse. Mary, the most sacred memory in his life, the deepest, truest, best. He had sworn, anyhow, that Iris Manning meant nothing to him. Through all his speculations, behind every thought, ran this horrid working jealousy. It poisoned him. It twisted truth. It moved like a wicked snake through mind and heart. Arthur, gripped by his new absorbing love for Iris Manning, lied. He couldn't believe it. He didn't believe it. He wouldn't believe it. Yet jealousy persisted in keeping the idea alive in him. It was a dreadful thought. He fell asleep on it. But his sleep was uneasy with feverish, unpleasant dreams that rambled on in fragments without coming to conclusion. Then, suddenly, the cry of the strange bird came into his dream. He started, turned over, woke up. The cry still continued. It was not a dream. He jumped out of bed. The room was gray with early morning, the air fresh and a little chill. The cry came floating over the lawn as before. He looked out, pain clutching at his heart. 2 figures stood below, a man and a girl, and the man was Arthur Dean. Yet the light was so dim, the morning being overcast, that had he not expected to see his friend, he would scarcely have recognized the familiar form in that shadowy outline that stood close beside the girl. Nor could he perhaps have recognized Iris Manning. Their backs were to him. They moved away, disappearing again into the little summer house, and this time he saw it beyond question. The two were hand in hand. Vague and uncertain as the figures were in the early twilight, he was sure of that. The first disagreeable sensation of surprise, disgust, anger that sickened him turned quickly, however, into one of another kind altogether. A curious feeling of superstitious dread crept over him, and a shiver ran again along his nerves. "Hello, Arthur!" he called from the window. There was no answer. His voice was certainly audible in the summer house, but no one came. He repeated the call a little louder, waited in vain for 30 seconds, then came, the same moment, to a decision that even surprised himself. For the truth was, he could no longer bear the suspense of waiting. He must see his friend at once and have it out with him. He turned and went deliberately down the corridor to Dean's bedroom. He would wait there for his return and know the truth from his own lips. But also another thought had come. The gun. He had quite forgotten it. The safety catch was out of order. He had not warned him. He found the door closed but not locked. Opening it cautiously, he went in. But the unexpectedness of what he saw gave him a genuine shock. He could hardly suppress a cry. Everything in the room was neat and orderly. No sign of disturbance anywhere, and it was not empty. There in bed before his very eyes was Arthur. The clothes were turned back a little. He saw the pajamas open at the throat. He lay sound asleep, deeply, peacefully asleep. So surprised, indeed, was Headley, that after staring a moment, Almost unable to believe his sight, he then put out a hand and touched him gently, cautiously on the forehead. But Arthur did not stir or wake. His breathing remained deep and regular. He lay sleeping like a baby. Headley glanced round the room, noticed the gun in the corner where he himself had put it the day before, and then went out, closing the door behind him softly. Arthur Dean, however, did not leave for London as he had intended, because he felt unwell and kept to his room upstairs. It was only a slight attack, apparently, but he must lie quiet. There was no need to send for a doctor. He knew just what to do. These passing attacks were common enough. He would be up and about again very shortly. Headley kept him company, saying no single word of what had happened. He read aloud to him, chatted and cheered him up. He had no other visitors. Within 24 hours he was himself once more. He and his friend had planned to leave the following day. But Headley, that last night in the house, felt an odd uneasiness and could not sleep. All night long he sat up reading, looking out of the window, smoking in a chair where he could see the stars and hear the wind and watch the huge shadow of the downs. The house lay very still as the hours passed. He dozed once or twice. Why did he sit up in this unnecessary way? Why did he leave his door ajar so that the slightest sound of another door opening or of steps passing along the corridor must reach him? Was he anxious for his friend? Was he suspicious? What was his motive? What his secret purpose? Headley did not know and could not even explain it to himself. He felt uneasy, that was all he knew. Not for worlds would he have let himself go to sleep or lose full consciousness that night. It was very odd. He could not understand himself. He merely obeyed a strange deep instinct that bade him wait and watch. His nerves were jumpy. In his heart lay some unexplicable anxiety that was pain. The dawn came slowly. The stars faded one by one. The line of the downs showed their grand bare curves against the sky. Cool and cloudless, the September morning broke above the little Sussex pleasure house. He sat and watched the east grow bright. The early wind brought a scent of marshes and the sea into his room. Then suddenly it brought a sound as well, the haunting cry of the bird with its 3 following notes. And this time there came an answer. Headley knew then why he had sat up. A wave of emotion swept him as he heard, an emotion he could not attempt to explain. Dread, wonder, longing seized him. For some seconds he could not leave his chair because he did not dare to. The low-pitched cries of call and answer rang in his ears like some unearthly music. With an effort he started up, went to the window and looked out. This time the light was sharp and clear. No mist hung in the air. He saw the crimsoning sky, reflected like a band of shining metal in the reach of river beyond the lawn. He saw dew on the grass, a sheet of pallid silver. He saw the summer house, empty of any passing figures. For this time the 2 figures stood plainly in view before his eyes upon the lawn. They stood there, hand in hand, sharply defined, unmistakable in form and outline. Their faces, moreover, turned upwards to the window where he stood, staring down in pain and amazement at them, at Arthur Dean and Mary. They looked into his eyes. He tried to call, but no sound left his throat. They began to move across the dew-soaked lawn. They went, he saw, with a floating, undulating motion towards the river shining in the dawn. Their feet left no marks upon the grass. They reached the bank, but did not pause in their going. They rose a little, floating like silent birds across the river. Turning in midstream, they smiled towards him, waved their hands with a gesture of farewell. Then, rising still higher into the opal dawn, their figures passed into the distance slowly, melting away against the sunlit marshes and the shadowing downs beyond. They disappeared. Headley never quite remembers actually leaving the window, crossing the room, or going down the passage. Perhaps he went at once. Perhaps he stood gazing into the air above the downs for a considerable time, unable to tear himself away. He was in some marvelous dream, it seemed. The next thing he remembers, at any rate, was that he was standing beside his friend's bed, trying in his distraught anguish of heart to call him from that sleep which, on earth, knows no awakening. End of The Call.
The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shreya Sethi. The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as I best could. But when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled. But the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato, although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared. He prided himself on his connoisseurship in wine. Few Italians have the true virtuoso spirit. For the most part, their enthusiasm is adopted to suit the time and opportunity to practice imposture upon the British and Austrian millionaires. In painting and gemmery, Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack. But in the matter of old wines he was sincere. In this respect I did not differ from him materially. I was skilful in the Italian vintages myself, and bought largely whenever I could. It was about dusk one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting patry-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today! But I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How?" said he. "Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible! And in the middle of the carnival." "I have my doubts," I replied, "and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain." "Amontillado?" "I have my doubts." "Amontillado!" "And I must satisfy them." "Amontillado!" "As you are engaged, I am on my way to Lucchesi. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me. Lucchesi cannot tell Amontillado from sherry. And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own. Come, let us go." "Whither?" "To your waltz." "My friend, no. I will not impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement. Lucchesi?" "I have no engagement. Come." "My friend, no. It is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceive you are afflicted. The walls are insufferably damp. They are encrusted with nitre. Let us go nevertheless. The cold is merely nothing, Amontillado. You have been imposed upon. And as for Lucchesi, he cannot distinguish sherry from Amontillado. Thus speaking, Fortunato possessed himself of my arm. Putting on a mask of black silk and drawing a roquelaire closely about my person, I suffered him to hurry me to my palazzo. There were no attendants at home. They had absconded to make merry in honor of the time. I had told them that I should not return until the morning, and had given them explicit orders not to stir from the house. These orders were sufficient, I well knew, to ensure their immediate disappearance, one and all, as soon as my back was turned. I took from their sconces 2 flambeaux, and giving one to Fortunato, bowed him through several suites of rooms to the archway that led into the vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent, and stood together on the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bells upon his cap jingled as he strode. "The pipe," said he. "It is farther on," said I. "But observe the white web work which gleams from these cavern walls." He turned towards me and looked into my eyes with 2 filmy orbs that distilled the rheum of intoxication. "Nitre?" he asked at length. "Nitre," I replied. "How long have you had that cough?" Ahem, ahem, ahem. My poor friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes. "It is nothing," he said at last. "Come," I said with decision. "We will go back. Your health is precious. You are rich, respected, admired, beloved. You are happy, as once I was. You are a man to be missed. For me it is no matter. We will go back. You will be ill, and I cannot be responsible. Besides, there is Lucchesi." "Enough," he said. "The cough is a mere nothing. It will not kill me. I shall not die of a cough." "True, true," I replied, "and indeed I had no intention of alarming you unnecessarily. But you should use all proper precaution. A draught of this medoc will defend us from the damps." Here I knocked off the neck of a bottle which I drew from a long row of its fellows that lay upon the mould. "Drink," I said, pressing him the wine. He raised it to his lips with a leer. He paused and nodded to me familiarly, while his bells jingled. "I drink," he said, "to the buried that repose around us." "And I to your long life." He again took my arm, and we proceeded. "These vaults," he said, "are extensive." "The Montresors," I replied, "were a great and numerous family." "I forget your arms." A huge human foot tore in a field azure. The foot crushes a serpent rampant whose fangs are embedded in the heel. "And the motto?" "Nemo me impune lacessit." "Good," he said. The wine sparkled in his eyes and the bells jingled. My own fancy grew warm with the medoc. We had passed through the walls of piled bones, with casks and puncheons intermingling into the inmost recesses of catacombs. I paused again, and this time I made bold to seize Fortunato by an arm above the elbow. "The nitre," I said. "See, it increases. It hangs like moss upon the walls. We are below the river's bed. The drops of moisture tickle among the bones. Come, we will go back ere it is too late. Your cough?" "It is nothing," he said. "Let us go on. But first, another draught of the medoc." I broke and reached him a flagon of de Grève. He emptied it at a breath. His eyes flashed with a fierce light. He laughed and threw the bottle upwards with a gesticulation I did not understand. I looked at him in surprise. He repeated the movement, a grotesque one. "You do not comprehend," he said. "Not I replied. "Then you are not of the Brotherhood." "How? You are not one of the Masons." "Yes, yes," I said. "Yes, yes." "You? Impossible." "A Mason." "A Mason," I replied. "A sign," he said, "a sign." "It is this," I answered, producing a trowel from beneath the folds of my roquelaire. "You jest," he exclaimed, recoiling a few paces. "But let us proceed to the Amontillado." "Be it so," I said, replacing the tool beneath the cloak and again offering him my arm. He leaned upon it heavily. We continued our route in search of the Amontillado. We passed through a range of low arches, descended, passed on, and descending again, arrived at a deep crypt, in which the foulness of the air caused our flambeau rather to glow than flame. At the most remote end of the crypt there appeared another less spacious. Its wall had been lined with human remains, piled to the vault overhead in the fashion of the great catacombs of Paris. Three sides of this interior crypt were still ornamented in this manner. From the fourth side the bones had been thrown down, and lay promiscuously upon the earth, forming at one point a mound of some size. Within the wall thus exposed by the distancing of the bones we perceived a still interior recess, in depth about 4 feet, in width 3, in height 6 or 7. It seemed to have been constructed for no especial use within itself, but formed merely the interval between two of the colossal supports of the roof of the catacombs, and was backed by one of their circumscribing walls of solid granite. It was in vain that Fortunato, uplifting his dull torch, endeavoured to pry into the depth of the recess. Its termination the feeble light did not enable us to see. "Proceed," I said. "Herein is the Amontillado. As for Lucchesi—" "He is an ignoramus," interrupted my friend, as he stepped unsteadily forward, while I followed immediately at his heels. In an instant he had reached the extremity of the niche, and finding his progress arrested by the rock, stood stupidly bewildered. A moment more and I had fettered him to the granite. In its surface were 2 iron staples, distant from each other about 2 feet, horizontally. From one of these depended a short chain, from the other a padlock. Throwing the links about his waist, it was but the work of a few seconds to secure it. He was too much astonished to resist. Withdrawing the key, I stepped back from the recess. "Pass your hand," I said, "over the wall. You cannot help feeling the night air. Indeed, it is very damp. Once more, let me implore you to return." "No? Then I must positively leave you. But I must first render you all the little attentions in my power." "The Amontillado!" ejaculated my friend, not yet recovered from his astonishment. "True," I replied, "the Amontillado." As I said these words, I busied myself among the pile of bones of which I have spoken before. Throwing them aside, I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar. With these materials and with the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance of the niche. I had scarcely laid the first tier of the masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had in a great measure worn off. The earliest indication I had of this was a low moaning cry from the depth of the recess. It was not the cry of a drunken man. There was then a long and obstinate silence. I laid the second tier and the third and the fourth, and then I heard the furious vibrations of the chain. The noise lasted for several minutes, during which that I might hearken to it with the more satisfaction. I ceased my labours and sat down upon the bones. When at last the clanking subsided, I resumed the trowel, and finished without interruption the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh tier. The wall was now nearly upon a level with my breast. I again paused, and holding the flambeau over the mason work, threw a few feeble rays upon the figure within. A succession of loud and shrill screams, bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form, seemed to thrust me violently back. For a moment I hesitated. I trembled. Unsheathing my rapier, I began to grope with it about the recess, but the thought of an instant reassured me. I placed my hand upon the solid fabric of the catacombs and felt satisfied. I reapproached the wall. I replied to the yells of him who clamoured. I re-echoed, I aided, I surpassed them in volume and in strength. I did this, and the clamourer grew still. It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it partially in its destined position. But now there came from out the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice, which I had difficulty in recognizing as that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said, "Ha, ha, a very good joke indeed, an excellent jest. We shall have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo, over our wine." "The Amontillado," I said. "Yes, the Amontillado. But is it not getting late? Will not they be awaiting us at the palazzo, the Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone." "Yes," I said, "let us be gone." "For the love of God, Montresor!" "Yes," I said, "for the love of God." But to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud, "Fortunato!" No answer. I called again, "Fortunato!" No answer still. I thrust a torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in reply only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick on account of the dampness of the catacombs. I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry, I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century no mortal has disturbed them. In pace requiescat. End of the Cask of Amontillado. Recording by Shreya Sethi.
The Cats of Ulthar by H.P. Lovecraft. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clark Pigeot. The Cats of Ulthar by H.P. Lovecraft. It is said that in Ulthar, which lies beyond the river Skye, no man may kill a cat, and this I can verily believe, as I who gaze upon him who sitteth purring before the fire. For the cat is cryptic, and close to strange things which men cannot see. He is the soul of antique Egyptus, and bearer of tales from forgotten cities in Meroe and Ophir. He is the kin of the jungle's lords, and heir to the secrets of hoary and sinister Africa. The Sphinx is his cousin, and he speaks her language, but he is more ancient than the Sphinx, and remembers that which she hath forgotten. In Ulthar, before ever the burgesses forbade the killings of cats, there dwelt an old cotter and his wife who delighted to trap and slay the cats of their neighbors. Why they did this I know not. save that many hate the voice of the cat in the night, and take it ill that cats should run stealthily about yards and gardens at twilight. But whatever the reason, this old man and woman took pleasure in trapping and slaying every cat which came near their hovel. And from some of the sounds heard after dark, many villagers fancied that the manner of slaying was exceedingly peculiar. But the villagers did not discuss such things with the old man and his wife because of the habitual expression on the withered faces of the two, and because their cottage was so small and so darkly hidden under spreading oaks at the back of a neglected yard. In truth, much as the owners of the cats hated these odd folks, they feared them more, and instead of berating them as brutal assassins, merely took care that no cherished pet or mouser should stray towards the remote hovel under the dark trees. When, through some unavoidable oversight, a cat was missed, and sounds heard after dark, the loser would lament impotently, or console himself by thanking fate that it was not one of his children who had thus vanished. For the people of Ulthar were simple, and knew not whence it is all cats first came. One day, a caravan of strange wanderers from the south entered the narrow, cobbled streets of Ulthar. Dark wanderers they were, and unlike the other roving folk who passed through the village twice every year. In the market-place they sold fortunes for silver, and bought gay beads from the merchants. What was the land of these wanderers none could tell, but it was seen that they were given to strange prayers, and that they had painted on the sides of their wagons strange figures with humanoid bodies, and the heads of cats, hawks, rams, and lions. And the leader of the caravan wore a headdress with 2 horns and a curious disc betwixt the horns. There was, in this singular caravan, a little boy, with no father or mother, but only a tiny black kitten to cherish. The plague had not been kind to him, yet had left him this small furry thing to mitigate his sorrows. And when one is very young, one can find great relief in the lively antics of a black kitten. So the boy, whom the dark people called Menes, smiled more often than he wept, as he sat playing with his graceful kitten on the steps of an oddly painted wagon. On the 3rd morning of the wanderer's stay in Ulthar, Menes could not find his kitten, and as he sobbed aloud in the marketplace, certain villagers told him of the old man and his wife, and of sounds heard in the night. And when he heard these things, his sobbing gave place to meditation, and finally to prayer. He stretched out his arms towards the sun and prayed in a tongue no villager could understand, though indeed the villagers did not try very hard to understand, since their attention was mostly taken up by the sky and the odd shapes the clouds were assuming. It was very peculiar, but as the little boy uttered his petition, there seemed to form overhead the shadowy, nebulous figures of exotic things, of hybrid creatures crowned with horn-flanked discs. Nature's full of such illusions to impress the imaginative. That night, the wanderers left Ulthar and were never seen again. And the households were troubled when they noticed that in all the village there was not a cat to be found. From each hearth the familiar cat had vanished. Cats large and small, black, gray, striped, yellow, and white. Old Cranon, the burgomaster, swore that the dark folk had taken the cats away in revenge for the killing of Mene's kitten, and cursed the caravan and the little boy. But Nith, the lean notary, declared that the old cotter and his wife were more likely persons to suspect, for their hatred of cats was notorious and increasingly bold. Still, no one durst complain to the sinister couple, even when little Atul, the innkeeper's son, vowed that he had at twilight seen all the cats of Ulthar in that accursed yard, under the trees, pacing very slowly and solemnly in a circle around the cottage, two abreast, as if in performance of some unheard-of rite of beasts. The villagers did not know how much to believe from so small a boy, and though they feared that the evil pair had charmed the cats to their death, they preferred not to chide the old cotter till they met him outside his dark and repellent yard. So Ulthar went to sleep in vain anger, and when the people awakened at dawn, behold, every cat was back at his accustomed hearth, large and small, black and grey, striped yellow and white. None was missing. Very sleek and fat did the cats appear, and sonorous with purring content. The citizens talked with one another of the affair, and marveled not a little. Old Cranon again insisted that it was the dark folk who had taken them, since cats did not return alive from the cottage of the ancient man and his wife. But all agreed on one thing, that the refusal of all the cats to eat their portions of meat or drink their saucers of milk was exceedingly curious. And for 2 whole days the sleek, lazy cats of Ulthar would touch no food, but only doze by the fire or in the sun. It was fully a week before the villagers noticed that no lights were appearing at dusk in the windows of the cottage under the trees. Then the lean Nith remarked that no one had seen the old man or his wife since the night the cats were away. In another week the burgomaster decided to overcome his fears and call at the strangely silent dwelling as a matter of duty, though in doing so he was careful to take with him Shang the blacksmith and Thull the cutter of stone as witnesses. And when they had broken down the frail door, they found only this: 2 cleanly picked human skeletons on the earthen floor, and a number of singular beetles crawling in the shadowy corners. There was, subsequently, much talk among the burgesses of Ulthar. Zath, the coroner, disputed at length with Nith, the lead notary, and Cranon and Shang and Thull were overwhelmed with the questions. Even little Attal, the innkeeper's son, was closely questioned and given a sweetmeat as reward. They talked of the old cotter and his wife, of the caravan of dark wanderers, of small Menes and his black kitten, of the prayer of Menes and of the sky during that prayer, of the doings of the cats on the night the caravan left, and of what was later found in the cottage under the dark trees in the repellent yard. And in the end the burgesses passed that remarkable law which is told by traders in Hatheg and discussed by travellers in near, namely, that in Ulthar no man may kill a cat. End of Cats of Ulthar by H.P. Lovecraft. Recording by Clark Peugeot.
A Dead Finger by Sabine Baring Gould. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Davis Verity. Why the National Gallery should not attract so many visitors as, say, the British Museum, I cannot explain. The latter does not contain much that, one would suppose, appeals to the interest of the ordinary sightseer. What knows such of prehistoric flints and scratched bones? Of Assyrian sculpture? Of Egyptian hieroglyphics? The Greek and Roman statuary is cold and dead. The paintings in the National Gallery glow with color and are instinct with life. Yet somehow, a few listless wanderers saunter yawning through the National Gallery, whereas swarms pour through the halls of the British Museum, and talk and pass remarks about the objects there exposed, of the date and meaning of which they have not the faintest conception. I was thinking of this problem, and endeavoring to unravel it, one morning whilst sitting in the room for English masters at the Great Collection in Trafalgar Square. At the same time, another thought forced itself upon me. I had been through the rooms devoted to foreign schools, and had then come into that given over Reynolds, Moreland, Gainsborough, Constable, and Hogarth. The morning had been for a while propitious. but towards noon a dense umber-tinted fog had come on, making it all but impossible to see the pictures and quite impossible to do them justice. I was tired and so seated myself on one of the chairs and fell into the consideration first of all of why the National Gallery is not as popular as it should be, and secondly, how it was that the British school had no beginnings like those of Italy and the Netherlands. We can see the art of the painter from its first initiation in the Italian peninsula and among the Flemings. It starts on its progress like a child, and we can trace every stage of its growth. Not so with English art. It springs to life in full and splendid maturity. Who were there before Reynolds and Gainsborough and Hogarth? The names of those portrait and subject painters who have left their canvases upon the walls of our country houses were those of foreigners, Holbein, Kneller, Van Dyck, and Lilly for portraits, and Monier for flower and fruit pieces. Landscapes, figure subjects were all importations, none homegrown. How came that about? Was there no limner that was native? Was it that fashion trampled on homegrown pictorial beginnings as it flouted and spurned native music? Here was food for contemplation. Dreaming in the brown fog, looking through it without seeing its beauties, at Hogarth's painting of Lavinia Fenton as Polly Peachum, without wondering how so indifferent a beauty could have captivated the Duke of Bolton and held him for 30 years, I was recalled to myself and my surroundings by the strange conduct of a lady who had seated herself on the chair next to me, also discouraged by the fog, and awaiting its dispersion. I had not noticed her particularly. At the present moment I do not remember particularly what she was like. So far as I can recollect, she was middle-aged and quietly, yet well-dressed. It was not her face nor her dress that attracted my attention and disturbed the current of my thoughts. The effect I speak of was produced by her strange movements and behavior. She was sitting listless, probably thinking of nothing at all, or nothing in particular, when, in turning her eyes round, and finding that she could see nothing of the paintings, she began to study me. This did concern me greatly. A cat may look at the king, but to be contemplated by a lady is a compliment sufficient to please any gentleman. It was not gratified vanity that troubled my thoughts, but the consciousness that my appearance produced, first of all a startled surprise, then undisguised alarm, and finally indescribable horror. Now a man can sit quietly leaning on the head of his umbrella and glow internally, warmed and illumined by the consciousness that he is being surveyed with admiration by a lovely woman, even when he is middle-aged and not fashionably dressed, but no man can maintain his composure when he discovers himself to be an object of aversion and terror. What was it? I passed my hand over my chin and upper lip, thinking it not impossible that I might have forgotten to shave that morning, and in my confusion not considering that the fog would prevent the lady from discovering neglect in this particular, had it occurred, which it had not. I am a little careless, perhaps, about shaving when in the country, but when in town, never. The next idea that occurred to me was, a smut. Had a London black, curdled in that dense pea-soup atmosphere, descended on my nose and blackened it? I hastily drew my silk handkerchief from my pocket, moistened it, and passed it over my nose, and then each cheek. I then turned my eyes into the corners and looked at the lady to see whether by this means I had got rid of what was objectionable in my personal appearance. Then I saw that her eyes, dilated with horror, were riveted not on my face, but on my leg. My leg! What on earth could that harmless member have in it so terrifying? The morning had been dull, there had been rain in the night, and I admit that on leaving my hotel I had turned up the bottoms of my trousers. That is a proceeding not so uncommon, not so outrageous as to account for the stony stare of the woman's eyes. If that were all, I would turn my trousers down. Then I saw her shrink from the chair on which she sat to one further removed from me, but still with her eyes fixed on my leg, about the level of my knee. She had let fall her umbrella and was grasping the seat of her chair with both hands, as she backed from me. I need hardly say that I was greatly disturbed in mind and feelings, and forgot all about the origin of the English schools and painters, and the question why the British Museum is more popular than the National Gallery. Thinking that I might have been spattered by a hansom whilst crossing Oxford Street, I passed my hand down my side hastily with a sense of annoyance, and all at once touched something cold, clammy, that sent a thrill to my heart, and made me start and take a step forward. At the same moment, the lady, with a cry of horror, sprang to her feet and with raised hands fled from the room, leaving her umbrella where it had fallen. There were other visitors to the picture gallery besides ourselves who had been passing through the saloon, and they turned at her cry and looked in surprise after her. The policeman stationed in the room came to me and asked what had happened. I was in such agitation that I hardly knew what to answer. I told him that I could explain what had occurred little better than himself. I had noticed that the lady had worn an odd expression and had behaved in most extraordinary fashion, and that he had best take charge of her umbrella and wait for her return to claim it. This questioning by the official was vexing, as it prevented me from at once and on the spot investigating the cause of her alarm and mine. Hers as something she must have seen on my leg, and mine as something I had distinctly felt creeping up my leg. The numbing and sickening effect on me of the touch of the object I had not seen was not to be shaken off at once. Indeed, I felt as though my hand were contaminated, and that I could have no rest till I had thoroughly washed the hand, and, if possible, washed away the feeling that had been produced. I looked on the floor, I examined my leg, but saw nothing. As I wore my overcoat, it was probable that in rising from my seat the skirt had fallen over my trousers and hidden the thing, whatever it was. I therefore hastily removed my overcoat and shook it, then looked at my trousers. There was nothing whatever on my leg, and nothing fell from my overcoat when shaken. Accordingly, I reinvested myself, and hastily left the gallery, then took my way as speedily as I could, without actually running, to the Charing Cross station and down the narrow way leading to the Metropolitan, where I went into Faulkner's bath and hairdressing establishment and asked for hot water to thoroughly wash my hand and well soap it. I bathed my hand in water as hot as I could endure it, employed carbolic soap, and then after having a good brush down, especially on my left side where my hand had encountered the object that had so affected me, I left. I had entertained the intention of going to the Princess's Theatre that evening, and of securing a ticket in the morning, but all thought of theatre going was gone from me. I could not free my heart from the sense of nausea and cold that had been produced by the touch. I went into Gotti's to have lunch, and ordered something, I forget what, but when served, I found that my appetite was gone. I could eat nothing. The food inspired me with disgust. I thrust it from me untasted, and after drinking a couple glasses of claret, left the restaurant and returned to my hotel. Feeling sick and faint, I threw my overcoat over the sofa back and cast myself on my bed. I do not know that there was any particular reason for my doing so, but as I lay, my eyes were on my great coat. The density of the fog has passed away, and there was light again, not of first quality, but sufficient for a Londoner to swear by, so that I could see everything in my room, through a veil, darkly. I do not think my mind was occupied in any way. About the only occasions on which, to my knowledge, my mind is actually passive or inert is when crossing the channel in the foam from Dover to Calais, when I am always in every weather abjectly seasick and thoughtless. But as I now lay on my bed, uncomfortable, squeamish, without knowing why, I was in the same inactive mental condition, but not for long. I saw something that startled me. First, it appeared to me as if the lappet of my overcoat pocket were in movement, being raised. I did not pay much attention to this, as I supposed that the garment was sliding down onto the seat of the sofa from the back, and that this displacement of gravity caused the movement I observed. But this I soon saw was not the case. That which moved the lappet was something in the pocket that was struggling to get out. I could see now that it was working its way up the inside, and that when it reached the opening it lost balance and fell down again. I can make this out by the projections and indentations in the cloth. These moved as the creature, or whatever it was, worked its way up to the lining. "A mouse," I said, and forgot my seatiness. I was interested. The little rascal. However did it he contrive to seat himself in my pocket? And I have worn that overcoat all morning. But no, it was not a mouse. I saw something white poke its way out from under the lappet, and in another moment an object was revealed that, though revealed, I could not understand, nor could I distinguish what it was. Now, roused by curiosity, I raised myself on my elbow. In doing this I made some noise. The bed creaked. Instantly the something dropped to the floor, lay outstretched for a moment to recover itself, then began, with the motions of a maggot, to run along the floor. There is a caterpillar called the measurer, because, when it advances, it draws its tail up to where its head is and then throws forward its full length, and again draws up its extremity, forming at each time a loop, and with each step measuring its total length. The object I now saw on the floor was advancing precisely like the measuring caterpillar. It had the color of a cheese maggot, and in length was about 3.5 inches. It was not, however, like a caterpillar, which is flexible throughout its entire length, but this was, as it seemed to me, jointed in 2 places, one joint being more conspicuous than the other. For some moments, I was so completely paralyzed by the astonishment that I remained motionless, looking at the thing as it crawled along the carpet, a dull green carpet with darker green, almost black flowers in it. It had, as it seemed to me, a glossy head, distinctly marked, but, as the light was not brilliant, I could not make out very clearly, and moreover, the rapid movements prevented close scrutiny. Presently, with a shock still more startling than it produced by its apparition at the opening of the pocket of my greatcoat, I became convinced that what I saw was a finger, a human forefinger, and that the glossy head was no other than the nail. The finger did not seem to have been amputated. There was no sign of blood or laceration where the knuckle should be, but the extremity of the finger, or root rather, faded away to indistinctness, and I was unable to make out the root of the finger. I could see no hand, no body behind this finger, nothing whatever except a finger that had little token of warm life in it, no coloration as though blood circulated in it, and this finger was in active motion creeping along the carpet towards a wardrobe that stood against the wall by the fireplace. I sprang off the bed and pursued it. Evidently the finger was alarmed, for it redoubled its pace, reached the wardrobe, and went under it. By the time I had arrived at the article of furniture, it had disappeared. I lit a Vesta match and held it beneath the wardrobe that was raised above the carpet by about 2 inches, on turned feet, but I could see nothing more of the finger. I got my umbrella and thrust it beneath, and raked forwards and backwards, right and left, and raked out flue, and nothing more solid. I packed my portmanteau next day and returned to my home in the country. All desire for amusement in town was gone, and the faculty to transact business had departed as well. A languor and qualms had come over me, and my head was in a maze. I was unable to fix my thoughts on anything. At times I was disposed to believe that my wits were deserting me, at others that I was on the verge of a severe illness. Anyhow, whether likely to go off my head or not, or to take my bed, home was the only place for me, and homeward I sped accordingly. On reaching my country habitation, my servant, as usual, took my portmanteau to my bedroom, unstrapped it, but did not unpack it. I object to his throwing out the contents of my Gladstone bag, not that there is anything in it that he may not see, but that he puts my things where I cannot find them again. My clothes, he is welcome to place them where he likes and where they belong, and this latter he knows better than I do. But then I carry about with me other things than a dress suit, and changes of linen and flannel. There are letters, papers, books, and the proper destinations of these are known only to myself. A servant has a singular and evil knack of putting away literary matter and odd volumes in such places that it takes the owner half a day to find them again. Although I was uncomfortable, and my head in a whirl, I opened and unpacked my own portmanteau. As I was thus engaged, I saw something curled up in my collar box, the lid of which had gotten broken by a boot heel impinging on it. I had pulled off the damaged cover to see if my collars had been spoiled, when something curled up inside suddenly rose on end and leapt, just like a cheese jumper, out of the box, over the edge of the Gladstone bag, and scurried away across the floor in a manner already familiar to me. I could not doubt for a moment what it was. Here was the finger again. It had come with me from London to the country. Whither it went in its run over the floor I do not know. I was too bewildered to observe. Somewhat later, towards evening, I seated myself in my easy-chair, took up a book, and tried to read. I was tired with the journey, with the knocking about in town, and the discomfort and alarm produced by the apparition of the finger. I felt worn out. I was unable to give my attention to what I read, and before I was aware was asleep. Roused for an instant by the fall of a book from my hands, I speedily relapsed into unconsciousness. I am not sure that a doze in the armchair ever does good. It usually leaves me in a semi-stupid condition and with a headache. 5 minutes in, a horizontal position on my bed is worth 30 in a chair. That is my experience. In sleeping in a sedentary position, that the head is a difficulty. It drops forward or lolls on one side or the other, and has to be brought back into a position in which the line to the center of gravity runs through the trunk, otherwise the head carries the body over in a sort of general capsize out of the chair onto the floor. I slept, on the occasion of which I am speaking, pretty healthily because deadly weary, but I was brought to waking, not by my head falling over the arm of the chair and my trunk tumbling after it, but by a feeling of cold extending from my throat to my heart. When I awoke, I was in a diagonal position with my right ear resting on my right shoulder and exposing the left side of my throat, and it was here, where the jugular vein throbs, that I felt the greatest intensity of cold. At once I shrugged my left shoulder, rubbing my neck with the collar of my coat in so doing. Immediately something fell off upon the floor, and again I saw the finger. My disgust, horror, were intensified when I perceived that it was dragging something after it, which might have been an old stocking in which I took at first glance for something of the sort. The evening sun shone in through my window in a brilliant gold ray that lighted the object as it scrambled along. With this illumination I was able to distinguish what the object was. It was not easy to describe it, but I will make the attempt. The finger I saw was solid and material. What it drew after it was neither, or was in a nebulous, protoplasmic condition. The finger was attached to a hand that was curdling into matter and in process of acquiring solidity. Attached to the hand was an arm in a very filmy condition, and this arm belonged to a human body in a still more vaporous, immaterial condition. This was being dragged along the floor by the finger, just as a silkworm might pull after it the tangle of its web. I could see legs and arms and head and coat-tail tumbling about and interlacing and disentangling again in a promiscuous manner. There were no bone, no muscle, no substance in the figure. The members were attached to the trunk, which was spineless, but they had evidently no functions, and were wholly dependent on the finger which pulled them along in a jumble of parts as it advanced. In such confusion did the whole vaporous matter seem, that I cannot say for certain it was so, but the impression left on my mind was that one of the eyeballs was looking out at a nostril, and the tongue lolling out of one of the ears. It was, however, only for a moment that I saw this germ body. I cannot call by another name that which had not more substance than smoke. I saw it only so long as it was being dragged athwart the ray of sunlight. The moment it was pulled jerkily out of the beam into the shadow beyond, I could see nothing of it, only the crawling finger. I had not sufficient moral energy or physical force in me to rise, pursue, and stamp on the finger, and grind it with my heel into the floor. Both seemed drained out of me. What became of the finger, whither it went, how it managed to discreet itself, I do not know. I had lost the power to inquire. I sat in my chair, chilled, staring before me into space. "Please, sir," a voice said, "that's Mr. Square below, electrical engineer." "Eh?" I looked dreamily around. My valet was at the door. "Please, sir, the gentleman would be glad to be allowed to go over the house and see all the electrical apparatus is in order." "Oh, indeed. Yes, show him up." I had recently placed the lighting of my house in the hands of an electrical engineer, a very intelligent man, Mr. Square, for whom I had contracted a sincere friendship. He had built a shed with a dynamo out of sight, and had entrusted the laying of the wires to subordinates, as he had been busy with other orders and could not personally watch every detail. But he was not the man to let anything pass unobserved, and he knew that electricity was not a force to be played with. Bad or careless workmen will often insufficiently protect the wires or neglect the insertion of the lead which serves as a safety valve in the event of the current being too strong. Houses may be set on fire, human beings fatally shocked by the neglect of a bad or slovenly workman. The apparatus for my mansion was just completed, but Mr. Square had come to inspect it and make sure that it was all right. He was an enthusiast in the matter of electricity and saw for it a vast perspective, the limits of which could not be predicted. "All forces," said he, "are correlated. When you have force in one form, you may just turn it into this or that as you like. In one form, it is motive power, in another it is light, in another heat. Now we have electricity for illumination. We employ it, but not as freely as in the States, for propelling vehicles. Why should we have horses drawing our buses? We should use only electric trams. Why do we burn coal to warm our shins? There is electricity, which throws out no filthy smoke as does coal. Why should we let the tides waste their energies in the Thames, in other estuaries? There we have nature supplying us, free, gratis, and for nothing, with all the force we want for propelling, for heating, for lighting. I will tell you something more, my dear sir," said Mr. Square. I have mentioned but 3 modes of force and have instanced but a limited number of uses to which electricity may be turned. How is it with photography? Is not electric light becoming an artistic agent? I bet you, said he. Before long, it will become a therapeutic agent as well. Oh yes, I have heard of certain impostors with their life belts. Mr. Square did not relish with this little dig I gave him. He winced but returned to the charge. We don't know how to direct it all right, that is all, said he. I haven't taken the matter up, but others will, I bet, and we shall have electricity used as freely as now we use powders and pills. I don't believe in doctor's stuff myself. I hold that disease lays hold of a man because he lacks physical force to resist it. Now, is it not obvious that you are beginning at the wrong end when you attack the disease? What you want is to supply force, make up for the lack of physical power, and force is force wherever you find it. Here motive, there illuminating, and so on. I don't see why a physician should not utilize the tide rushing out under London Bridge for restoring the feeble vigor of all who are languid and a prey to disorder in the metropolis. It will come to that, I bet, and that is not all. Force is force everywhere, political, moral force, physical force, dynamic force, heat, light, tidal waves, and so on. All are one, all is one. In time we shall know how to galvanize into aptitude and moral energy all the limp and crooked consciences and wills that need taking in hand, and such there always will be in modern civilization. I don't know how to do it, I don't know how it will be done, but in the future the priest as well as the doctor will turn electricity on as his principal, nay, his only agent, and he can get his force anywhere, out of the running stream, out of the wind, out of the tidal wave. I'll give you an instance, continued Mr. Square, chuckling and rubbing his hands, to show you the great possibilities in electricity, used in a crude fashion. In a certain great city far west in the States, a go-ahead place, too, more so than New York, they had electric trams all up and down and along the roads to everywhere. The union men working for the company demanded that the non-unionists should be turned off. But the company didn't see it. Instead, it turned off the union men. It had up its sleeve a sufficiency of the others and filled all places at once. Union men didn't like it and passed word that at a given hour on a certain day every wire was to be cut. The company knew this by means of its spies and turned on, ready for them, 3 times the power into all the wires. At the fixed moment, up the poles went the strikers to cut the cables, and down they came a dozen times quicker than they went up. Then there came wires to the hospitals from all quarters for stretchers to carry off the disabled men, some with broken legs, arms, ribs. 2 or 3 had their necks broken. I reckon the company was wonderfully merciful. It didn't put on sufficient force to make cinders of them, then and there. Possibly opinion might not have liked it. Stopped the strike, did that. Great moral effect, all done by electricity. In this manner Mr. Square was wont to rattle on. He interested me, and I came to think that there might be something in what he said, that his suggestions were not mere nonsense. I was glad to see Mr. Square enter my room, shown in by my man. I did not rise from my chair to shake his hand, for I had not sufficient energy to do so. In a languid tone, I welcomed him and signed to him to take a seat. Mr. Square looked at me with some surprise. "Why, what's the matter?" he said. "You seem unwell. Not got the flu, have you?" "I beg your pardon?" "The influenza. Every 3rd person is crying out that he has it, and the sale of eucalyptus is enormous. Not that eucalyptus is any good. Influenza microbes, indeed. What care they for eucalyptus? We've gone down some steps of the ladder of life since I last saw you, Squire." "How do you account for that?" I hesitated about the mentioning the extraordinary circumstances that had occurred, but Square was a man who would not allow any beating about the bush. He was downright and straight, and in 10 minutes he got the entire story out of me. "Rather boisterous for your nerves, that, a crawling finger," said he. "It's a queer story taken on end." Then he was silent, considering. After a few minutes he rose and said, "I'll go and look at the fittings, and then I'll turn this little matter of yours over again and see if I can't knock the bottom out of it. I'm kinder fond of those sort of things." Mr. Square was not a Yankee, but he had lived for some time in America and affected to speak like an American. He used expressions, terms of speech common in the States, but had none of the transatlantic twang. He was a man absolutely without affection in every other particular. This was his sole weakness, and it was harmless. The man was so thorough in all he did that I did not expect him to return immediately. He was certain to examine every portion of the dynamo engine and all the connections and burners. This would necessarily engage him for some hours. As the day was nearly done, I knew he could not accomplish what he wanted that evening, and accordingly gave orders that a room should be prepared for him. Then, as my head was full of pain and my skin was burning, I told my servant to apologize for my absence from dinner and tell Mr. Square that I was really forced to return to my bed by sickness, and that I believed I was about to be prostrated by an attack of influenza. The valet, a worthy fellow, who had been with me for 6 years, was concerned at my appearance and urged me to allow him to send for a doctor. I had no confidence in the local practitioner, and if I sent for another from the nearest town, I should offend him, and a row would perhaps ensue, so I declined. If I were really in for an influenza attack, I knew about as much as any doctor how to deal with it. Quinine, that was all. I bade my man light a small lamp, lower it, so as to give sufficient illumination to enable me to find some lime juice at my bedhead and my pocket handkerchief, and to be able to read my watch. When he had done this, I bade him leave me. I lay in bed, burning, racked with pain in my head, and my eyeballs on fire. Whether I fell asleep or went off my head for a while, I cannot tell. I may have fainted. I have no recollection of anything after going to bed and taking a sip of lime juice that tasted to me like soap, till I was roused by a sense of pain in my ribs, a slow, gnawing, torturing pain, waxing momentarily more intense. In half-consciousness, I was partly dreaming and partly aware of actual suffering. The pain was real, but in my fancy I thought that a great maggot was working its way into my side between my ribs. I seemed to see it. It twisted itself half round, then reverted to its former position, again twisted itself, moving like a bradawl, not like a gimlet, which latter forms a complete revolution. This obviously must have been a dream, hallucination only, as I was lying on my back and my eyes were directed towards the bottom of my bed. The coverlet and blankets and sheet intervened between my eyes and the side. But in fever one sees without eyes, and in every direction, and through all obstructions. Roused thoroughly by an excruciating twinge, I tried to cry out, and succeeded in throwing myself over on my right side, that which was in pain. At once I felt the thing withdrawn that was awling, if I may use the word, in between my ribs. And now I saw, standing beside the bed, a figure that had its arm under the bedclothes and was slowly removing it. The hand was leisurely drawn from under the coverings and rested on the eider-down coverlet with the forefinger extended. The figure was that of a man, in shabby clothes, with a sallow, mean face, a retreating forehead, and hair cut after the French fashion, and a mustache. The jaws and chin were covered with a bristly growth, as if shaving had been neglected for a fortnight. The figure did not appear to be thoroughly solid, but to be of the consistency of curd, and the face was of the complexion of curd. As I looked at this object, it withdrew, sliding backward in an odd sort of manner, and as though overweighted by the hand, which was the most substantial, indeed the only substantial portion of it. Though the finger retreated stooping, yet it was no longer huddled along by the finger, as if it had no material existence. If the same, it had acquired a consistency and a solidity which it did not possess before. How it vanished, I do not know, nor whither it went. The door opened, and Square came in. "What?" he explained with cheery voice. "Influenza, is it?" "I don't know. I think it's that finger again." "Now look here," said Square. "I'm not going to have that cuss at its pranks any more. Tell me about it." I was now so exhausted, so feeble, that I was not able to give a connected account of what had taken place, but Square put me just a few pointed questions and elicited the main facts. He pieced them together in his own orderly mind so as to form a connected whole. "There is a feature in the case," said he, "that strikes me as remarkable and important. At first, a finger only, then a hand, then a nebulous figure attached to the hand, without backbone, without consistency. Lastly, a complete form, with consistency and with backbone, but the latter in a gelatinous condition, and the entire figure overweighted by the hand, just as hand and figure were previously overweighted by the finger. Simultaneously with this compacting and consolidating of the figure came your degeneration and loss of vital force, and in a word, of health. What you lose, the object acquires, and what it acquires, it gains by contact with you. That's clear enough, is it not?" "I dare say. I don't know. I can't think." I suppose not. The faculty of thought is drained out of you. Very well. I must think for you, and I will. Force is force, and see if I can't deal with your visitant in such a way as will prove just as truly a moral dissuasive that employed on the Union men on strikin'. Never mind where it was. That's not the point. Will you kindly give me some lime juice? I entreated. I sipped the acid draught, but without relief. I listened to Square, but without hope. I wanted to be left alone. I was weary of my pain, weary of everything, even of life. It was a matter of indifference to me whether I recovered or slipped out of its existence. It will be here again shortly, said the engineer. As the French say, l'appétit vient mangeant. It has been at you thrice. It won't be content without another peck. And if it does get another, I guess it will pretty well about finish you. Mr. Square rubbed his chin and then put his hands into his trouser pockets. That was also a trick acquired in the States, and an elegant one. His hands, when not actively occupied, went into his pockets. Inevitably they gravitated thither. Ladies did not like Square. They said he was not a gentleman. But it was not that he said or did anything off color. Only he spoke to them, looked at them, and walked with them, always with his hands in his pockets. I have seen a lady turn her back on him deliberately because of this trick. Standing now with his hands in his pockets, he studied my bed and said contemptuously, "Old-fashioned and bad four-poster. Oughtn't be allowed, I guess. Unwholesome all the way around." I was not in a condition to dispute this. I like a four-poster with curtains at head and feet. Not that I ever draw them, but it gives a sense of privacy that is wanting in one of your half-tester beds. If there is a window at one's feet, one can lie in bed without the glare in one's eyes, and yet without darkening the room by drawing the blinds. There is much to be said for a four-poster, but this is not the place in which to say it. Mr. Square pulled his hands out of his pockets and began fiddling with the electric point near the head of my bed, attached a wire, swept it in a semicircle along the floor, then thrust the knob at the end into my hand in the bed. "Keep your eye open," he said, "and your hand shut and covered. If that finger comes again tickling your ribs, try it with the point. I'll manage the switch," from behind the curtain. Then he disappeared. I was too indifferent in my misery to turn my head and observe where he was. I remained inert, with the knob in my hand and my eyes closed, suffering and thinking of nothing but the shooting pains through my head and the aches in my loins and back and legs. Some time probably elapsed before I felt the finger again at work at my ribs. It groped, but no longer bored. I now felt the entire hand, not a single finger, and the hand was substantial, cold, and clammy. I was aware, how I know not, that if the finger point reached the region of my heart on the left side, that the hand would, so to speak, sit down on it, with the cold palm over it, and then immediately my heart would cease to beat, and it would be, as Square might express it, "gone coon with me." In self-preservation, I brought up the knob of the electric wire against the hand, against one of the ringers, I think, and at once was aware of a rapping, squealing noise. I turned my head languidly and saw the form, now more substantial than before, capering in an ecstasy of pain, endeavoring fruitlessly to withdraw its arm from under the bedclothes and the hand from the electric point. At the same moment, Square stepped from behind the curtain with a dry laugh and said, "I thought we should fix him. He has the coil about him and can't escape. Now let us drop to particulars. But I shan't let you off until I know all about you." The last sentence was addressed, not to me, but to the apparition. Thereupon he bade me to take the point away from the hand of the figure, being whatever it was, but to be ready with it at a moment's notice. He then proceeded to catechise my visitor, who moved restlessly within the circle of the wire, but could not escape from it. It replied in a thin, squealing voice that sounded as if to come from a distance, and had a querulous tone in it. I do not pretend to give all that was said. I cannot recollect everything that passed. My memory was affected by my illness, as well as my body. Yet I prefer giving the scraps that I recollect to what Square told me he had heard. Yes, I was unsuccessful, always was. Nothing answered with me. The world was against me. Society was. I hate society. I don't like work neither, never did. But I like agitating against what is established. I hate the royal family, the landed interest, the parsons, everything that is, except the people that is, the unemployed. I always did. I couldn't get work as suited me. When I died, they buried me in a cheap coffin, dirt cheap, and gave me a nasty grave, cheap, and a service rattled away, cheap, and no monument. Didn't want none. Oh, There are lots of us. All discontented. Discontent. That's a passion, it is. It gets into the veins. It fills the brain. It occupies the heart. It's a sort of divine cancer that takes possession of the entire man and makes him dissatisfied with everything and hate everybody. But we must have our share of happiness at some time. We all crave for it in one way or other. Some think is a future state of blessedness and so of hope, and look to attain it, for hope is a cable and anchor that attaches to what is real. But when you have no hope of that sort, don't believe in any future state, you must look for happiness in life here. We didn't get it when we were alive, so we seek to procure it after we are dead. We can't do it if we can get out of our cheap and nasty coffins, but not till the greater part of us is mouldered away. If a finger or two remains, that can work its way up to the surface. Those cheap deal coffins go to pieces quick enough. Then the only solid part of us left can pull the rest of us that has gone to nothing after it. Then we grope about after the living, the well-to-do if we can get at them, the honest working poor if we can't. We hate them too because they are content and happy. If we reach any of these and can touch them, then we can draw their vital force out of them into ourselves and recuperate at their expense. That was about what I was going to do with you, getting on famous. Nearly solidified into a new man and given another chance in life. But I've missed it this time, just my luck. Miss everything. Always have, except misery and disappointment. Get plenty of that. What are you all? Asked Swear. Anarchists out of employ? Some of us go by that name, some by other designations, but we are all one and own allegiance to but one monarch, sovereign discontent. We are bred to have a distaste for manual work, and we grow up loafers, grumbling at everything and quarreling with society that is around us and the providence that is above us. And what do you call yourselves now? Call ourselves? Nothing. We are the same, in another condition, that is all. Folk once called us anarchists, nihilists, socialists, levelers. Now they call us the influenza. The learned talk of microbes and bacilli and bacteria. Microbes, bacilli, and bacteria be blowed. We are the influenza. We are the social failures, the generally discontented, coming up out of our cheap and nasty graves in the form of physical disease. We are the influenza. There you are, I guess, exclaimed Square triumphantly. Did I not say that all forces were correlated? If so, then all negations, deficiencies of force are one in their several manifestations. Talk of divine discontent as a force impelling to progress. Rubbish. It is a paralysis of energy. It turns all it absorbs into acid, to envy, spite, gall. It inspires nothing but rots the whole moral system. Here you have it, moral, social, political discontent in another form, nay aspect, that is all. What anarchism is the body politic, the influenza is the body physical. Do you see that? Yes, I believe I answered, and dropped away into the land of dreams. I recovered. What Square did with the thing I do not know, but believe that he reduced it again to its former negative and self-decomposing condition. End of A Dead Finger. Recording by Davis Verity.
The Dead Smile by F. Marion Crawford. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rafe Ball. The Dead Smile by F. Marion Crawford. Chapter 1. Sir Hugh Ockram smiled as he sat by the open window of his study in the late August afternoon, and just then a curiously yellow cloud obscured the low sun, and the clear summer light turned lurid, as if it had been suddenly poisoned and polluted by the foul vapours of a plague. Sir Hugh's face seemed, at best, to be made of fine parchment drawn skin-tight over a wooden mask, in which two eyes were sunk out of sight and peered from far within through crevices under slanting, wrinkled lids, alive and watchful like two toads in their holes, side by side and exactly alike. But as the light changed, then a little yellow glare flashed in each. Nurse MacDonald said once that when Sir Hugh smiled he saw the faces of two women in hell, two dead women he had betrayed. Nurse MacDonald was 100 years old. And the smile widened, stretching the pale lips across the discoloured teeth in an expression of profound self-satisfaction, blended with the most unforgiving hatred and contempt for the human doll. The hideous disease of which he was dying had touched his brain. His son stood beside him, tall, white, and delicate as an angel in a primitive picture, and though there was deep distress in his violet eyes as he looked at his father's face, he felt the shadow of that sickening smile stealing across his own lips and parting them and drawing them against his will. And it was like a bad dream, for he tried not to smile, and smiled the more. Beside him, strangely like him in her wan, angelic beauty, with the same shadowy golden hair, the same sad violet eyes, the same luminously pale face, Evelyn Warburton rested one hand upon his arm, and as she looked into her uncle's eyes and could not turn her own away, she knew that the deathly smile was hovering on her own red lips, drawing them tightly across her little teeth, while two bright tears ran down her cheeks to her mouth and dropped from the upper to the lower lip while she smiled, and the smile was like the shadow of death and the seal of damnation upon her pure young face. "Of course," said Sir Hugh very slowly, and still looking out at the trees, "if you have made up your mind to be married, I cannot hinder you, and I don't suppose you attach the smallest importance to my consent." "Father!" exclaimed Gabriel reproachfully. "No, I do not deceive myself," continued the old man, smiling terribly. "You will marry when I am dead, though there is very good reason why you had better not. Why you had better not," he repeated very emphatically, and he slowly turned his toad eyes upon the lovers. "What reason?" asked Evelyn in a frightened voice. "Never mind the reason, my dear. You will marry just as if it did not exist." There was a long pause. "Two gone," he said, his voice lowering strangely. "And two more will be four, all together, for ever and ever, burning, burning, burning bright." At the last words his head sank slowly back, and the little glare of the toad eyes disappeared under the swollen lids, and the lurid cloud passed from the westering sun, so that the earth was green again and the light pure. Sir Hugh had fallen asleep, as he often did in his last illness, even while speaking. Gabriel Ockram drew Evelyn away, and from the study they went out into the dim hall, softly closing the door behind them, and each audibly drew breath, as though some sudden danger had been passed. They laid their hands each in the other's, and their strangely like eyes met in a long look, in which love and perfect understanding were darkened by the secret terror of an unknown thing. Their pale faces reflected each other's fear. "It is his secret," said Evelyn at last. "He will never tell us what it is." "If he dies with it," answered Gabriel, "let it be on his own head." "On his head," echoed the dim hall. It was a strange echo, and some were frightened by it, for they said that if it were a real echo it should repeat everything, and not give back a phrase here and there, now speaking, now silent. But Nurse MacDonald said that the great hall would never echo a prayer when an Ockram was to die, though it would give back curses 10 for 1. "On his head," it repeated quite softly, and Evelyn started and looked round. "It is only the echo," said Gabriel, leading her away. They went out into the late afternoon light and sat upon a stone seat behind the chapel, which was built across the end of the east wing. It was very still, not a breath stirred, and there was no sound near them. Only far off in the park a songbird was whistling the high prelude to the evening chorus. "It is very lonely here," said Evelyn, taking Gabriel's hand nervously, and speaking as if she dreaded to disturb the silence. "If it were dark, I should be afraid." "Of what? Of me?" Gabriel's sad eyes turned to her. "Oh no, how could I be afraid of you? But of the old Ockrams. They say they are just under our feet here in the north vault outside the chapel, all in their shrouds, with no coffins, as they used to bury them. As they always will, as they will bury my father and me. They say an Ockram will not lie in a coffin. But it cannot be true. These are fairy tales, ghost stories." Evelyn nestled nearer to her companion, grasping his hand more tightly, and the sun began to go down. "Of course. But there is the story of old Sir Vernon, who was beheaded for treason under James II. The family brought his body back from the scaffold in an iron coffin with heavy locks, and they put it in the north vault. But ever afterwards, whenever the vault was opened to bury another of the family, they found the coffin wide open, and the body standing upright against the wall, and the head rolled away in a corner, smiling at it." "As Uncle Hugh smiles?" Evelyn shivered. "Yes, I suppose so," answered Gabriel thoughtfully. "Of course, I never saw it, and the vault has not been opened for 30 years. None of us have died since then. And if Uncle Hugh dies, shall you—" Evelyn stopped, and her beautiful thin face was quite white. "Yes, I shall see him laid there too, with his secret, whatever it is." Gabriel sighed and pressed the girl's little hand. "I do not like to think of it," she said unsteadily. "Oh, Gabriel, what can the secret be? He said we had better not marry. Not that he forbade it, but he said it so strangely. And he smiled. Ah!" Her small white teeth chattered with fear, and she looked over her shoulder while drawing still closer to Gabriel. "And somehow I felt it in my own face." "So did I," answered Gabriel in a low, nervous voice. "Nurse MacDonald—" He stopped abruptly. "What? What did she say?" "Oh, nothing. She has told me things. They would frighten you, dear. Come, it is growing chilly." He rose, but Evelyn held his hand in both of hers, still sitting and looking up into his face. "But we shall be married, just the same. Gabriel, say that we shall." "Of course, darling, of course. But while my father is so very ill, it is impossible. Oh, Gabriel, Gabriel, dear, I wish we were married now," cried Evelyn in sudden distress. "I know that something will prevent it and keep us apart." "Nothing shall. Nothing human," said Gabriel Ockram as she drew him down to her. And their faces, that were so strangely alike, met and touched, and Gabriel knew that the kiss had a marvellous savour of evil. But on Evelyn's lips it was like the cool breath of a sweet and mortal fear. And neither of them understood, for they were innocent and young. Yet she drew him to her by her lightest touch, as a sensitive plant shivers and waves its thin leaves, and bends and closes softly upon what it wants. And he let himself be drawn to her willingly, as he would if her touch had been deadly and poisonous, for she strangely loved that half-voluptuous breath of fear, and he passionately desired the nameless evil something that lurked in her maiden lips. "It is as if we loved in a strange dream," she said. "I fear the waking," he murmured. "We shall not wake, dear. When the dream is over, it will have already turned into death, so softly that we shall not know it. But until then—" She paused, and her eyes sought his, and their faces slowly came nearer. It was as if they had thoughts in their red lips that foresaw and foreknew the deep kiss of each other. "Until then," she said again, very low, and her mouth was nearer to his. "Dream. Till then," murmured his breath. Chapter 2. Nurse MacDonald was 100 years old. She used to sleep sitting all bent together in a great old leathern armchair with wings, her feet in a bag footstool lined with sheepskin, and many warm blankets wrapped about her, even in summer. Beside her a little lamp always burned at night by an old silver cup in which there was something to drink. Her face was very wrinkled, but the wrinkles were so small and fine and near together that they made shadows instead of lines. 2 thin locks of hair that was turning from white to a smoky yellow again were drawn over her temples from under her starched white cap. Every now and then she woke, and her eyelids were drawn up in tiny folds like little pink silk curtains, and her queer blue eyes looked straight before her through doors and walls and worlds to a far place beyond. Then she slept again, and her hands lay one upon the other on the edge of the blanket. The thumbs had grown longer than the fingers with age, and the joints shone in the low lamplight like polished crab-apples. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the night, and the summer breeze was blowing the ivy branch against the panes of the window with a hushing caress. In the small room beyond, with the door ajar, the girl-maid who took care of Nurse MacDonald was fast asleep. All was very quiet. The old woman breathed regularly, and her indrawn lips trembled each time as the breath went out, and her eyes were shut. But outside the closed window there was a face, and violet eyes were looking steadily at the ancient sleeper, for it was like the face of Evelyn Warburton, though they were 80 feet from the sill of the window to the foot of the tower. Yet the cheeks were thinner than Evelyn's, and as white as a gleam, and the eyes stared, and the lips were not red with life. They were dead, and painted with new blood. Slowly Nurse MacDonald's wrinkled eyelids folded themselves back, and she looked straight at the face at the window while one might count 10. "Is it time?" she asked in her little old, far-away voice. While she looked, the face at the window changed, for the eyes opened wider and wider, till the white glared all round the bright violet, and the bloody lips opened over gleaming teeth, and stretched and widened and stretched again, and the shadowy golden hair rose and streamed against the window in the night breeze. And in answer to Nurse MacDonald's question came the sound that freezes the living flesh. That low moaning voice that rises suddenly like the scream of storm, from a moan to a wail, from a wail to a howl, from a howl to the fear shriek of the tortured dead. He who has heard knows, and he can bear witness that the cry of the banshee is an evil cry to hear alone in the deep night. When it was over, and the face was gone, Nurse MacDonald shook a little in her great chair, and still she looked at the black square of the window. But there was nothing more there, nothing but the night and the whispering ivy branch. She turned her head to the door that was ajar, and there stood the girl in her white gown, her teeth chattering with fright. "It is time, child," said Nurse MacDonald. "I must go to him, for it is the end." She rose slowly, leaning her withered hands upon the arms of the chair, and the girl brought her a woolen gown and a great mantle, and her crutch stick, and made her ready. But very often the girl looked at the window, and was unjointed with fear, and often Nurse MacDonald shook her head, and said words which the maid could not understand. "It was like the face of Miss Evelyn," said the girl at last, trembling. But the ancient woman looked up sharply and angrily, and her queer blue eyes glared. She held herself by the arm of the great chair with her left hand, and lifted up her crutch stick to strike the maid with all her might. But she did not. "You are a good girl," she said, "but you are a fool. Pray for wit, child, pray for wit, or else find service in another house than Ockram Hall. Bring the lamp, and help me under my left arm." The crutch stick clacked on the wooden floor, and the low heels of the woman's slippers clappered after her in slow triplets as Nurse MacDonald got toward the door. And down the stairs each step she took was a labour in itself, and by the clacking noise the waking servants knew she was coming very long before they saw her. No one was sleeping now, and there were lights and whisperings and pale faces in the corridors near Sir Hugh's bedroom, and now someone went in, and now someone came out, but every one made way for Nurse MacDonald, who had nursed Sir Hugh's father more than 80 years ago. The light was soft and clear in the room. There stood Gabriel Ockram by his father's bedside, and there knelt Evelyn Warburton, her hair lying like a golden shadow down her shoulders, and her hands clasped nervously together. And opposite Gabriel, a nurse was trying to make Sir Hugh drink, but he would not, and though his lips were parted, his teeth were set. He was very, very thin and yellow now, and his eyes caught the light sideways, and were as yellow coals. "Do not torment him," said Nurse MacDonald to the woman who held the cup. "Let me speak to him, for his hour is come." "Let her speak to him," said Gabriel in a dull voice. So the ancient woman leaned to the pillow and laid the feather weight of her withered hand, that was like a brown moth, upon Sir Hugh's yellow fingers, and she spoke to him earnestly, while only Gabriel and Evelyn were left in the room to hear. "Hugh Ockram," she said, "this is the end of your life, and as I saw you born, and saw your father born before you, I am come to see you die. Hugh Ockram, will you tell me the truth?" The dying man recognized the little far-away voice he had known all his life, and he very slowly turned his yellow face to Nurse MacDonald, but he said nothing. Then she spoke again. "Hugh Ockram, you will never see the daylight again. Will you tell the truth?" His toad-like eyes were not yet dull. They fastened themselves on her face. "What do you want of me?" he asked, and each word struck hollow upon the last. "I have no secrets. I have lived a good life." Nurse MacDonald laughed, a tiny cracked laugh that made her old head bob and tremble a little, as if her neck were on a steel spring. But Sir Hugh's eyes grew red, and his pale lips began to twist. "Let me die in peace," he said slowly. But Nurse MacDonald shook her head, and her brown, moth-like hand left his and fluttered to his forehead. "By the mother that bore you, and died of grief for the sins you did, tell me the truth." Sir Hugh's lips tightened on his discoloured teeth. "Not on earth," he answered slowly. "By the wife who bore your son and died heartbroken, tell me the truth." "Neither to you in life, nor to her in eternal death." His lips writhed as if the words were coals between them, and a great drop of sweat rolled across the parchment of his forehead. Gabriel Ockram bit his hand as he watched his father die, but Nurse MacDonald spoke a third time. "By the woman whom you betrayed, and who waits for you this night, Hugh Ockram, tell me the truth." "It is too late. Let me die in peace. The writhing lips began to smile across the set yellow teeth, and the toad eyes glowed like evil jewels in his head. "There is time," said the ancient woman. "Tell me the name of Evelyn Warburton's father. Then I will let you die in peace." Evelyn started back, kneeling as she was, and stared at Nurse MacDonald, and then at her uncle. "The name of Evelyn's father," he repeated slowly, while the awful smile spread upon his dying face. The light was growing strangely dim in the great room. As Evelyn looked, Nurse MacDonald's crooked shadow on the wall grew gigantic. Sir Hugh's breath came thick, rattling in his throat, as death crept in like a snake and choked it back. Evelyn prayed aloud, high and clear. Then something rapped at the window, and she felt her hair rise upon her head in a cool breeze as she looked around in spite of herself. And when she saw her own white face looking in at the window, and her own eyes staring at her through the glass, wide and fearful, and her own hair streaming against the pane, and her own lips dashed with blood, she rose slowly from the floor and stood rigid for one moment, till she screamed once and fell straight back into Gabriel's arms. But the shriek that answered hers was the fierce shriek of the tormented corpse, out of which the soul cannot pass for shame of deadly sins, though the devils fight in it with corruption, each for their due share. Sir Hugh Ockram sat upright in his deathbed, and saw, and cried aloud, "Evelyn!" His harsh voice broke and rattled in his chest as he sank down. But still Nurse MacDonald tortured him, for there was a little life left in him still. "You have seen the mother as she waits for you, Hugh Ockram. Who was this girl Evelyn's father? What was his name?" For the last time the dreadful smile came upon the twisted lips, very slowly, very surely now, and the toad eyes glared red, and the parchment face glowed a little in the flickering light. For the last time, words came. "They know it in hell." Then the glowing eyes went out quickly, the yellow face turned waxen pale, and a great shiver ran through the thin body as Hugh Ockram died. But in death he still smiled, for he knew his secret and kept it still on the other side. And he would take it with him, to lie with him for ever in the north vault of the chapel where the Ockrams lie uncoffined in their shrouds, all but one. Though he was dead, he smiled, for he had kept his treasure of evil truth to the end, and there was none left to tell the name he had spoken, but there was all the evil he had not undone left to bear fruit. As they watched, Nurse MacDonald and Gabriel, who held Evelyn still unconscious in his arms while he looked at the father, they felt the dead smile crawling along their own lips, the ancient crone and the youth with the angel's face. Then they shivered a little, and both looked at Evelyn as she lay with her head on his shoulder, and, though she was very beautiful, the same sickening smile was twisting her young mouth too, and it was like the foreshadowing of a great evil which they could not understand. But by and by they carried Evelyn out, and she opened her eyes, and the smile was gone. From far away in the great house the sound of weeping and crooning came up the stairs and echoed along the dismal corridors, for the women had begun to mourn the dead master after the Irish fashion, and the hall had echoes of its own all that night, like the far-off wail of the banshee among forest trees. When the time was come, they took Sir Hugh in his winding sheet on a trestle bier, and bore him to the chapel and through the iron door and down the long descent to the north vault, with tapers, to lay him by his father. And 2 men went in first to prepare the place, and came back staggering, like drunken men, and white, leaving their lights behind them. But Gabriel Ockram was not afraid, for he knew. And he went in alone, and saw that the body of Sir Vernon Ockram was leaning upright against the stone wall, and that its head lay on the ground near by, with the face turned up, and the dried leathern lips smiled horribly at the dried up corpse, while the iron coffin, lined with black velvet, stood open on the floor. Then Gabriel took the thing in his hands, for it was very light, being quite dried by the air of the vault, and those who peeped in from the door saw him lay it in the coffin again, and it rustled a little, like a bundle of reeds, and sounded hollow as it touched the sides and the bottom. He also placed the head upon the shoulders and shut down the lid, which fell to with a rusty spring that snapped. After that they laid Sir Hugh beside his father, with the trestle bier on which they had brought him, and they went back to the chapel. But when they saw one another's faces, master and men, they were all smiling with the dead smile of the corpse they had left in the vault, so that they could not bear to look at one another until it had faded away. Chapter 3. Gabriel Ockram became Sir Gabriel, inheriting the baronetcy with the half-ruined fortune left by his father. And still Evelyn Warburton lived at Ockram Hall, in the south room that had been hers ever since she could remember anything. She could not go away, for there were no relatives to whom she could have gone, and, besides, there seemed to be no reason why she should not stay. The world would never trouble itself to care what the Ockrams did on their Irish estates, and it was long since the Ockrams had asked anything of the world. So Sir Gabriel took his father's place at the dark old table in the dining room, and Evelyn sat opposite him until such time as their mourning should be over, and they might be married at last. And meanwhile their lives went on as before, since Sir Hugh had been a hopeless invalid during the last year of his life, and they had seen him but once a day for a little while, spending most of their time together in a strangely perfect companionship. But though the late summer saddened into autumn, and autumn darkened into winter, and storm followed storm, and rain poured on rain through the short days and the long nights, yet Ockram Hall seemed less gloomy since Sir Hugh had been laid in the north vault beside his father. And at Christmas-tide Evelyn decked the great hall with holly and green boughs, and huge fires blazed on every hearth. Then the tenants were all bidden to a New Year's dinner, and they ate and drank well, while Sir Gabriel sat at the head of the table. Evelyn came in when the port wine was brought, and the most respected of the tenants made a speech to propose her health. It was long, he said, since there had been a Lady Ockram. Sir Gabriel shaded his eyes with his hand and looked down at the table, but a faint colour came into Evelyn's transparent cheeks. But, said the grey-haired farmer, it was longer still since there had been a Lady Ockram so fair as the next was to be, and he gave the health of Evelyn Warburton. Then the tenants all stood up and shouted for her, and Sir Gabriel stood up likewise beside Evelyn. And when the men gave the last and loudest cheer of all, there was a voice not theirs, above them all, higher, fiercer, louder, a scream not earthly, shrieking for the bride of Ockram Hall. And the holly and the green boughs over the great chimney-piece shook and slowly waved as if a cool breeze were blowing over them. But the men turned very pale, and many of them set down their glasses, but others let them fall upon the floor for fear. And looking into one another's faces, they were all smiling strangely, a dead smile, like dead Sir Hugh's. One cried out words in Irish, and the fear of death was suddenly upon them all, so that they fled in panic, falling over one another like wild beasts in the burning forest, when the thick smoke runs along before the flame. And the tables were overset, and drinking glasses and bottles were broken in heaps, and the dark red wine crawled like blood upon the polished floor. Sir Gabriel and Evelyn stood alone at the head of the table before the wreck of the feast, not daring to turn to see each other, for each knew that the other smiled. But his right arm held her, and his left hand clasped her right as they stared before them, and but for the shadows of her hair, one might not have told their two faces apart. They listened long, but the cry came not again, and the dead smile faded from their lips, while each remembered that Sir Hugh Ockram lay in the north vault, smiling in his winding sheet, in the dark, because he had died with his secret. So ended the tenants' New Year's dinner. But from that time on, Sir Gabriel grew more and more silent, and his face grew even paler and thinner than before. Often, without warning and without words, he would rise from his seat as if something moved him against his will, and he would go out into the rain or the sunshine to the north side of the chapel, and sit on the stone bench, staring at the ground as if he could see through it, and through the vault below, and through the white winding sheet in the dark, to the dead smile that would not die. Always, when he went out in that way, Evelyn came out presently and sat beside him. Once, too, as in summer, their beautiful faces came suddenly near, and their lids drooped, and their red lips were almost joined together. But as their eyes met, they grew wide and wild, so that the white showed in a ring all round the deep violet, and their teeth chattered, and their hands were like hands of corpses, each in the other's, for the terror of what was under their feet, and of what they knew but could not see. Once, also, Evelyn found Sir Gabriel in the chapel alone, standing before the iron door that led down to the place of death, and in his hand there was the key to the door, but he had not put it into the lock. Evelyn drew him away, shivering, for she had also been driven in waking dreams to see that terrible thing again, and to find out whether it had changed since it had lain there. "I'm going mad," said Sir Gabriel, covering his eyes with his hand as he went with her. "I see it in my sleep. I see it when I am awake. It draws me to it day and night, and unless I see it I shall die." "I know," answered Evelyn. "I know. It is as if threads were spun from it, like a spider's, drawing us down to it." She was silent for a moment, and then she started violently and grasped his arm with a man's strength, and almost screamed the word she spoke. "But we must not go there," she cried. "We must not go." Sir Gabriel's eyes were half shut, and he was not moved by the agony of her face. "I shall die unless I see it again," he said, in a quiet voice not like his own. And all that day and that evening he scarcely spoke, thinking of it, always thinking, while Evelyn Warburton quivered from head to foot with a terror she had never known. She went alone, on a grey winter's morning, to Nurse MacDonald's room in the tower, and sat down beside the great leathern easy-chair, laying her thin white hand upon the withered fingers. "Nurse," she said, "what was it that Uncle Hugh should have told you, that night before he died? It must have been an awful secret, and yet, though you asked him, I feel somehow that you know it, and that you know why he used to smile so dreadfully." The old woman's head moved slowly from side to side. "I only guess. I shall never know," she answered slowly in her cracked little voice. "But what do you guess? Who am I? Why did you ask who my father was? You know I am Colonel Warburton's daughter, and my mother was Lady Ockram's sister, so that Gabriel and I are cousins. My father was killed in Afghanistan. What secret can there be?" "I do not know. I can only guess." "Guess what?" asked Evelyn imploringly, and pressing the soft withered hands as she leaned forward. But Nurse MacDonald's wrinkled lids dropped suddenly over her queer blue eyes, and her lips shook a little with her breath, as if she were asleep. Evelyn waited. By the fire the Irish maid was knitting fast, and the needles clicked like 3 or 4 clocks ticking against each other, and the real clock on the wall solemnly ticked alone, checking off the seconds of the woman who was 100 years old and had not many days left. Outside, the ivy branch beat the window in the wintry blast as it had beaten against the glass 100 years ago. Then, as Evelyn sat there, she felt again the waking of a horrible desire, the sickening wish to go down to the thing in the north vault, and to open the winding sheet and see whether it had changed. And she held Nurse MacDonald's hands as if to keep herself in her place and fight against the appalling attraction of the evil dead. But the old cat that kept Nurse MacDonald's feet warm, lying always on the bag footstool, got up and stretched itself and looked up into Evelyn's eyes, while its back arched and its tail thickened and bristled, and its ugly pink lips drew back in a devilish grin, showing its sharp teeth. Evelyn stared at it, half fascinated by its ugliness. Then the creature suddenly put out one paw with all its claws spread and spat at the girl, and all at once the grinning cat was like the smiling corpse far down below, so that Evelyn shivered down to her small feet and covered her face with her free hand, lest Nurse MacDonald should wake and see the dead smile there, for she could feel it. The old woman had already opened her eyes again, and she touched her cat with the end of her crutch-stick, whereupon its back went down, and its tail shrunk, and it sidled back to its place on the bag footstool. But its yellow eyes looked up sideways at Evelyn, between the slits of its lids. "What is it that you guess, nurse?" asked the young girl again. "A bad thing, a wicked thing. But I dare not tell you, lest it might not be true, and the very thought should blast your life. For, if I guess right, he meant that you should not know, and that you two should marry and pay for his old sin with your souls. He used to tell us that we ought not to marry. Yes, he told you that, perhaps. But it was as if a man put poisoned meat before a starving beast, and said, 'Do not eat,' but never raised his hand to take the meat away. And if he told you that you should not marry, it was because he hoped you would. For of all men, living or dead, Hugh Ockram was the falsest man that ever told a cowardly lie, and the cruellest that ever hurt a weak woman, and the worst that ever loved a sin." "But Gabriel and I love each other," said Evelyn, very sadly. Nurse MacDonald's old eyes looked far away, at sights seen long ago, and that rose in the grey winter air amid the mists of an ancient youth. "If you love, you can die together," she said, very slowly. "Why should you live, if it is true? I am 100 years old. What has life given me? The beginning is fire. The end is a heap of ashes. And between the end and the beginning lies all the pain of the world. Let me sleep, since I cannot die." Then the old woman's eyes closed again, and her head sank a little lower upon her breast. So Evelyn went away and left her asleep, with the cat asleep on the bag footstool, and the young girl tried to forget Nurse MacDonald's words, but she could not, for she heard them over and over again in the wind and behind her on the stairs. And as she grew sick with fear of the frightful unknown evil to which her soul was bound, she felt a bodily something pressing her, and pushing her, and forcing her on, and from the other side she felt the threads that drew her mysteriously. And when she shut her eyes, she saw in the chapel, behind the altar, the low iron door through which she must pass to go to the thing. And as she lay awake at night, she drew the sheet over her face, lest she should see shadows on the wall beckoning to her, and the sound of her own warm breath made whisperings in her ears, while she held the mattress with her hands to keep from getting up and going to the chapel. It would have been easier if there had not been a way thither through the library by a door which was never locked. It would be fearfully easy to take her candle and go softly through the sleeping house, and the key of the vault lay under the altar behind a stone that turned. She knew the little secret. She could go alone and see. But when she thought of it, she felt the hair rise on her head, and first she shivered so that the bed shook, and then the horror went through her in a cold thrill that was agony again, like myriads of icy needles boring into her nerves. Chapter 4. The old clock in Nurse MacDonald's tower struck midnight. From her room she could hear the creaking chains and weights in their box in the corner of the staircase, and overhead the jarring of the rusty lever that lifted the hammer. She had heard it all her life. It struck 11 strokes clearly, and then came the 12th, with a dull half-stroke, as though the hammer were too weary to go on and had fallen asleep against the bell. The old cat got up from the bag footstool and stretched itself, and Nurse MacDonald opened her ancient eyes and looked slowly round the room by the dim light of the night lamp. She touched the cat with her crutch stick, and it lay down upon her feet. She drank a few drops from her cup, and went to sleep again. But downstairs, Sir Gabriel sat straight up as the clock struck, for he had dreamed a fearful dream of horror, and his heart stood still till he awoke at its stopping, and it beat again furiously with his breath, like a wild thing set free. No Ockram had ever known fear waking, but sometimes it came to Sir Gabriel in his sleep. He pressed his hands to his temples as he sat up in bed, and his hands were icy cold, but his head was hot. The dream faded far, and in its place there came the master thought that racked his life. With the thought also came the sick twisting of his lips in the dark that would have been a smile. Far off, Evelyn Warburton dreamed that a dead smile was on her mouth, and awoke, starting with a little moan, her face in her hands, shivering. But Sir Gabriel struck a light and got up and began to walk up and down his great room. It was midnight, and he had barely slept an hour, and in the north of Ireland the winter nights are long. "I shall go mad," he said to himself, holding his forehead. He knew that it was true. For weeks and months the possession of the thing had grown upon him like a disease, till he could think of nothing without thinking first of that. And now, all at once, it outgrew his strength, and he knew that he must be its instrument or lose his mind, that he must do the deed he hated and feared, if he could fear anything, or that something would snap in his brain and divide him from life while he was yet alive. He took the candlestick in his hand, the old-fashioned heavy candlestick that had always been used by the head of the house. He did not think of dressing, but went as he was, in his silk night-clothes and his slippers, and he opened the door. Everything was very still in the great old house. He shut the door behind him and walked noiselessly on the carpet through the long corridor. A cool breeze blew over his shoulder and blew the flame of his candle straight out from him. Instinctively he stopped and looked round, but all was still, and the upright flame burned steadily. He walked on, and instantly a strong draught was behind him, almost extinguishing the light. It seemed to blow him on his way, ceasing whenever he turned, coming again when he went on, invisible, icy. Down the great staircase to the echoing hall he went, seeing nothing but the flaring flame of the candle standing away from him over the guttering wax, while the cold wind blew over his shoulder and through his hair. On he passed through the open door into the library, dark with old books and carved bookcases. On through the door in its shelves, with painted shelves on it, and the imitated backs of books, so that one needed to know where to find it, and it shut itself after him with a soft click. He entered the low-arched passage, and though the door was shut behind him and fitted tightly in its frame, still the cold breeze blew the flame forward as he walked. And he was not afraid, but his face was very pale, and his eyes were wide and bright, looking before him, seeing already in the dark air the picture of the thing beyond. But in the chapel he stood still, his hand on the little turning stone tablet in the back of the stone altar. On the tablet were engraved words: Clavis sepulchri clarissimorum dominorum de Ocram, the key to the vault of the most illustrious lords of Ocram. Sir Gabriel paused and listened. He fancied that he heard a sound far off in the great house where all had been so still, but it did not come again. Yet he waited at the last and looked at the low iron door. Beyond it, down the long descent, lay his father, uncoffined, 6 months dead, corrupt, terrible in his clinging shroud. The strangely preserving air of the vault could not yet have done its work completely, but on the thing's ghastly features, with their half-dried open eyes, there would still be the frightful smile with which the man had died, the smile that haunted. As the thought crossed Sir Gabriel's mind, he felt his lips writhing, and he struck his own mouth in wrath with the back of his hand so fiercely that a drop of blood ran down his chin, and another, and more, falling back in the gloom upon the chapel pavement. But still his bruised lips twisted themselves. He turned the tablet by the simple secret. It needed no safer fastening, for had each Ocram been confined in pure gold, and had the door been open wide, there was not a man in Tyrone brave enough to go down to that place, saving Gabriel Ocram himself, with his angel's face and his thin white hands and his sad, unflinching eyes. He took the great old key and set it into the lock of the iron door, and the heavy rattling noise echoed down the descent beyond like footsteps, as if a watcher had stood behind the iron and were running away within with heavy dead feet. And though he was standing still, the cool wind was from behind him, and blew the flame of the candle against the iron panel. He turned the key. Sir Gabriel saw that his candle was short. There were new ones on the altar with long candlesticks, and he lit one and left his own burning on the floor. As he set it down on the pavement, his lip began to bleed again, and another drop fell upon the stones. He drew the iron door open and pushed it back against the chapel wall so that it should not shut of itself while he was within, and the horrible draught of the sepulchre came up out of the depths in his face, foul and dark. He went in, but though the fetid air met him, yet the flame of the tall candle was blown straight from him against the wind, while he walked down the easy incline with steady steps, his loose slippers slapping the pavement as he trod. He shaded the candle with his hand, and his fingers seemed to be made of wax and blood as the light shone through them. And in spite of him, the unearthly draught forced the flame forward till it was blue over the black wick, and it seemed as if it must go out. But he went straight on, with shining eyes. The downward passage was wide, and he could not always see the walls by the struggling light, but he knew when he was in the place of death by the larger, drearier echo of his steps in the greater space, and by the sensation of a distant blank wall. He stood still, almost enclosing the flame of the candle in the hollow of his hand. He could see a little, for his eyes were growing used to the gloom. Shadowy forms were outlined in the dimness, where the biers of the Ockrams stood crowded together, side by side, each with its straight, shrouded corpse strangely preserved by the dry air, like the empty shell that the locust sheds in summer. And a few steps before him he saw clearly the dark shape of headless Sir Vernon's iron coffin, and he knew that nearest to it lay the thing he sought. He was as brave as any of those dead men had been, and they were his fathers, and he knew that sooner or later he should lie there himself, beside Sir Hugh, slowly drying to a parchment shell. But he was still alive, and he closed his eyes a moment, and 3 great drops stood on his forehead. Then he looked again, and by the whiteness of the winding sheet he knew his father's corpse, for all the others were brown with age, and, moreover, the flame of the candle was blown toward it. He made 4 steps till he reached it, and suddenly the light burned straight and high, shedding a dazzling yellow glare upon the fine linen that was all white, save over the face, and where the joined hands were laid on the breast. And at those places ugly stains had spread, darkened with outlines of the features and of the tight-clasped fingers. There was a frightful stench of drying death. As Sir Gabriel looked down, something stirred behind him, softly at first, then more noisily, and something fell to the stone floor with a dull thud and rolled up to his feet. He started back and saw a withered head lying almost face upward on the pavement, grinning at him. He felt the cold sweat standing on his face, and his heart beat painfully. For the first time in all his life, that evil thing which men called fear was getting hold of him, checking his heartstrings as a cruel driver checks a quivering horse, clawing at his backbone with icy hands, lifting his hair with freezing breath, climbing up and gathering in his midriff with leaden weight. Yet presently he bit his lip and bent down, holding the candle in one hand, to lift the shroud back from the head of the corpse with the other. Slowly he lifted it. Then it clove to the half-dried skin of the face, and his hand shook as if someone had struck him on the elbow. But half in fear and half in anger at himself, he pulled it so that it came away with a little ripping sound. He caught his breath as he held it, not yet throwing it back, and not yet looking. The horror was working in him, and he felt that old Vernon Ockram was standing up in his iron coffin, headless, yet watching him with the stump of his severed neck. While he held his breath, he felt the dead smile twisting his lips. In sudden wrath at his own misery, he tossed the death-stained linen backward and looked at last. He ground his teeth lest he should shriek aloud. There it was, the thing that haunted him, that haunted Evelyn Warburton, that was like a blight on all that came near him. The dead face was blotched with dark stains, and the thin grey hair was matted about the discoloured forehead. The sunken lids were half open, and the candlelight gleamed on something foul where the toad eyes had lived. But yet the dead thing smiled, as it had smiled in life. The ghastly lips were parted and drawn wide and tight upon the wolfish teeth, cursing still, and still defying hell to do its worst, defying, cursing, and always and for ever smiling, alone in the dark. Sir Gabriel opened the winding sheet where the hands were, and the blackened, withered fingers were closed upon something stained and mottled. Shivering from head to foot, but fighting like a man in agony for his life, he tried to take the package from the dead man's hold. But as he pulled at it, the claw-like fingers seemed to close more tightly, and when he pulled harder, the shrunken hands and arms rose from the corpse with a horrible look of life following his motion. Then, as he wrenched the sealed packet loose at last, the hands fell back into their place, still folded. He set down the candle on the edge of the bier to break the seals from the stout paper, and, kneeling on one knee to get a better light, he read what was within, written long ago in Sir Hugh's queer hand. He was no longer afraid. He read how Sir Hugh had written it all down, that it might perchance be a witness of evil and of his hatred, how he had loved Evelyn Warburton, his wife's sister, and how his wife had died of a broken heart with his curse upon her, and how Warburton and he had fought side by side in Afghanistan, and Warburton had fallen. But Ockram had brought his comrade's wife back a full year later, and little Evelyn, her child, had been born in Ockram Hall. And next, how he had wearied of the mother, and she had died like her sister with his curse on her. And then, how Evelyn had been brought up as his niece, and how he had trusted that his son Gabriel and his daughter, innocent and unknowing, might love and marry, and the souls of the women he had betrayed might suffer another anguish before eternity was out. And, last of all, he hoped that some day, when nothing could be undone, the two might find his writing and live on, not daring to tell the truth, for their children's sake, and the world's word, man and wife. This he read, kneeling beside the corpse in the north vault, by the light of the altar candle. And when he had read it all, he thanked God aloud that he had found the secret in time. But when he rose to his feet and looked down at the dead face, it was changed, and the smile was gone from it forever, and the jaw had fallen a little, and the tired, dead lips were relaxed. And then there was a breath behind him, and close to him, not cold like that which had blown the flame of the candle as he came, but warm and human. He turned suddenly. There she stood, all in white, with her shadowy golden hair, for she had risen from her bed and followed him noiselessly, and had found him reading, and had herself read over his shoulder. He started violently when he saw her, for his nerves were unstrung, and then he cried out her name in the still place of death. "Evelyn!" "My brother," she answered softly and tenderly, putting out both hands to meet his. End of The Dead Smile. Recording by Rafe Ball.
A Diagnosis of Death by Ambrose Bierce. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Diagnosis of Death by Ambrose Bierce. I am not so superstitious as some of your physicians, men of science, as you are pleased to be called, said Hofer, replying to an accusation that had not been made. Some of you, only a few, I confess, believe in the immortality of the soul, and in apparitions which you have not the honesty to call ghosts. I go no further than a conviction that the living are sometimes seen where they are not, but have been, where they have lived so long, perhaps so intensely, as to have left their impress on everything about them. I know indeed that one's environment may be so affected by one's personality as to yield, long afterward, an image of oneself to the eyes of another. Doubtless the impressing personality has to be the right kind of personality, as the perceiving eyes have to be the right kind of eyes. Mine, for example. Yes, the right kind of eyes, conveying sensations to the wrong kind of brains, said Dr. Fraley, smiling. Thank you. One likes to have an expectation gratified. That is about the reply I suppose you would have the civility to make. Pardon me, but you say that you know. That is a good deal to say, don't you think? Perhaps you will not mind the trouble of saying how you learned. You will call it a hallucination, Hofer said. But that does not matter. And he told the story. Last summer I went, as you know, to pass the hot weather term in the town of Meridian. The relative at whose house I had intended to stay was ill, so I sought other quarters. After some difficulty, I succeeded in renting a vacant dwelling that had been occupied by an eccentric doctor of the name of Mannering, who had gone away years before, no one knew where, not even his agent. He had built the house himself and had lived in it with an old servant for about 10 years. His practice, never very extensive, had after a few years been given up entirely. Not only so, but he had withdrawn himself almost altogether from social life and become a recluse. I was told by the village doctor, about the only person with whom he had any relations, that during his retirement he had devoted himself to a single line of study, the result of which he had expounded in a book that did not commend itself to the approval of his professional brethren, who indeed considered him not entirely sane. I have not seen the book, and cannot now recall the title of it, but I am told that it expounded a rather startling theory. He held that it was possible in the case of many a person in good health to forecast his death with precision, several months in advance of the event. The limit, I think, was 18 months. There were local tales of his having exerted his powers of prognosis, or perhaps you would say diagnosis, and it was said that in every instance the person whose friends he had warned had died suddenly at the appointed time, and from no assignable cause. All of this, however, has nothing to do with what I have to tell. I thought it might amuse a physician. The house was furnished, just as he had lived in it. It was a rather gloomy dwelling for one who was neither a recluse nor a student, and I think it gave something of its character to me, perhaps some of its former occupant's character, for always I felt in it a certain melancholy that was not in my natural disposition, nor, I think, due to loneliness. I had no servants that slept in the house, but I have always been, as you know, rather fond of my own society, being much addicted to reading, though little to study. Whatever was the cause, the effect was dejection and a sense of impending evil. This was especially so in Dr. Mannering's study. Although the room was the lightest and most airy in the house, the doctor's life-size portrait in oil hung in that room, and seemed completely to dominate it. There was nothing unusual in the picture. The man was evidently rather good-looking, about 50 years old, iron gray hair, a smooth shaven face, and dark serious eyes. Something in the picture always drew and held my attention. The man's appearance became familiar to me and rather haunted me. One evening I was passing through his room to my bedroom with a lamp. There was no gas in Meridian. I stopped as usual before the portrait, which seemed in the lamplight to have a new expression, not easily named, but distinctly uncanny. It interested, but not disturbed me. I moved the lamp from one side to the other, and observed the effects of the altered light. While so engaged, I felt an impulse to turn around. As I did so, I saw a man moving across the room directly toward me. As soon as he came near enough for the lamplight to illuminate the face, I saw that it was Dr. Mannering himself. It was as if the portrait were walking. "I beg your pardon," I said somewhat coldly, "but if you knocked, I did not hear." He passed me within an arm's length, lifted his right forefinger as in warning, and without a word went on out of the room, though I observed his exit no more than I observed his entrance. Of course, I need not tell you this was what you will call a hallucination, and I call an apparition. That room had only 2 doors, of which one was locked and the other led into a bedroom, from which there was no exit. My feeling on realizing this is not an important part of the incident. Doubtless this seems to you a very commonplace ghost story, one constructed on the irregular lines laid down by the old masters of the art. If that were so, I should not have related it, even if it were true. The man was not dead. I met him today in Union Street. He passed me in the crowd. Hover had finished his story, and both men were silent. Dr. Fraley absently drummed on the table with his fingers. "Did he say anything today?" he asked. "Anything from which you inferred that he was not dead?" Hover stared and did not reply. Perhaps, continued Fraley, he made a sign, a gesture, lifted a finger as in warning. It's a trick he had, a habit when saying something serious. Announcing the rest of a diagnosis, for example. Yes, he did, just as his apparition had done. But good God, did you ever know him? Hover was apparently growing nervous. I knew him. I have read his book, as will every physician some day. It is one of the most striking and important of the century's contributions to medical science. Yeah, I knew him. I attended him in an illness 3 years ago, and he died. Hover sprang from his chair, manifestly disturbed. He strode forward and back across the room, then approached his friend, and in a voice not altogether steady said, Doctor, have you anything to say to me as a physician? No, Hover. You are the healthiest man I have ever knew. As a friend, I advise you to go to your room. You play the violin like an angel. Play it. Play something light and lively. Get this cursed bad business off your mind. The next day, Hover was found dead in his room, the violin at his neck, the bow upon the string, his music open before him, at Chopin's funeral march. End of a diagnosis of death.
Four Weird Tales. The Insanity of Jones, A Study in Reincarnation, Part 1, by Algernon Blackwood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Four Weird Tales. Part 1, The Insanity of Jones, A Study in Reincarnation, by Algernon Blackwood. Adventures come to the adventurous, and mysterious things fall in the way of those who, with wonder and imagination, are on the watch for them. But the majority of people go past the doors that are half ajar, thinking them closed, and fail to notice the faint stirrings of the great curtain that hangs ever in the form of appearances between them and the world of causes behind. For only to the few whose inner senses have been quickened, perchance by some strange suffering in the depths, or by a natural temperament bequeathed from a remote past, comes the knowledge, not too welcome, that this greater world lies ever at their elbow, and that any moment a chance combination of moods and forces may invite them to cross the shifting frontier. Some, however, are born with this awful certainty in their hearts, and are called to no apprenticeship, and to this select company Jones undoubtedly belonged. Some, however, are born with this awful certainty in their hearts, and are called to no apprenticeship, and to this select company Jones undoubtedly belonged. All his life he had realized that his senses brought him to merely a more or less interesting set of sham appearances, that space, as men measure it, was utterly misleading, that time, as the clock ticked it in a succession of minutes, was arbitrary nonsense, and in fact that all his sensory perceptions were but a clumsy misrepresentation of real things behind the curtain, things he was forever trying to get at, and that sometimes he actually did get at. He had always been tremblingly aware that he stood on the borderland of another region, a region where time and space were merely forms of thought, where ancient memories lay open to the sight, and where the forces behind each human life stood plainly revealed, and he could see the hidden springs at the very heart of the world. Moreover, the fact that he was a clerk in a fire insurance office, and did his work with strict attention, never allowed him to forget for one moment that just beyond the dingy brick walls where the 100 men scribbled with pointed pens beneath the electric lamps, there existed this glorious region where the important part of himself dwelt, and moved, and had its being. For in this region he pictured himself playing the part of a spectator to his ordinary workaday life, watching like a king the stream of events, but untouched in his own soul by the dirt, the noise, and the vulgar commotion of the outer world. And this was no poetic dream merely. Jones was not playing prettily with idealism to amuse himself. It was a living, working belief. So convinced was he that the external world was the result of a vast deception practiced upon him by the gross senses, that when he started at a great building like St. Paul's, he felt it would not very much surprise him to see it suddenly quiver like a shape of jelly and then melt utterly away, while in its place stood all at once revealed the mass of color, or the great intricate vibrations, or the splendid sound, the spiritual idea, which it represented in stone. For something in this way it was that his mind worked. Yet, to all appearances, and in the satisfaction of all business claims, Jones was normal and unenterprising. He felt nothing but contempt for the wave of modern psychism. He hardly knew the meaning of such words as clairvoyance and clairaudience. He had never felt the least desire to join the Theosophical Society and to speculate in theories of astral plane life, or elementals. He attended no meetings of the Psychical Research Society, and knew no anxiety as to whether his aura was black or blue. Nor was he conscious of the slightest wish to mix in with the revival of cheap occultism which proved so attractive to weak minds of mystical tendencies and unleashed imaginations. There were certain things he knew, but none he cared to argue about, and he shrank instinctively from attempting to put names to the contents of this other region, knowing well that such names could only limit and define things that, according to any standards in use in the ordinary world, were simply undefinable and elusive. So that, although this was the way his mind worked, there was clearly a very strong leaven of common sense in Jones. In a word, the man the world and the office knew as Jones was Jones. His name summed him up and labeled him correctly: John Enderby Jones. Among the things that he knew, and therefore never cared to speak or speculate about, one was that he plainly saw himself as the inheritor of a long series of past lives, the net result of painful evolution, always as himself, of course, but in numerous different bodies, each determined by the behavior of the preceding one. The present John Jones was the last result to date all of the previous thinking, feeling, and doing of John Jones in earlier bodies and in other centuries. He pretended to no details nor claimed distinguished ancestry, for he realized his past must have been utterly commonplace and insignificant to have produced his present. But he was just as sure he had been at this weary game for ages as that he breathed, and it never occurred to him to argue, to doubt, or to ask questions. And one result of this belief was that his thoughts dwelt upon the past rather than upon the future, that he read much history, and felt especially drawn to certain periods whose spirit he understood instinctively as though he had lived in them, and that he found all religions uninteresting because, almost without exception, they start from the present and speculate ahead as to what men shall become, instead of looking back and speculating why men have got here as they are. In the insurance office he did his work exceedingly well, but without much personal ambition. Men and women he regarded as the impersonal instruments for inflicting upon him the pain or pleasure he had earned by his past workings, for chance had no place in his scheme of things at all, and while he recognized that the practical world could not get along unless every man did his work thoroughly and conscientiously, he took no interest in the accumulation of fame or money for himself, and simply, therefore, did his plain duty with indifference as to results. In common with others who lead a strictly impersonal life, he possessed the quality of utter bravery, and was always ready to face any combination of circumstances, no matter how terrible, because he saw in them the just working out of past causes he had himself set in motion, which could not be dodged or modified. And whereas the majority of people had little meaning for him, either by way of attraction or repulsion, the moment he met someone with whom he felt his past had been vitally interwoven, his whole inner being leapt up instantly and shouted the fact in his face, and he regulated his life with the utmost skill and caution, like a sentry on watch for an enemy whose feet could already be heard approaching. Thus, while the great majority of men and women left him uninfluenced, since he regarded them as so many souls merely passing with him along the great stream of evolution, there were, here and there, individuals with whom he recognized that the smallest intercourse was of the gravest importance. These were persons with whom he knew in every fiber of his being he had accounts to settle, pleasant or otherwise, arising out of dealings in past lives. And into his relations with these few, therefore, he concentrated as it were the efforts that most people spread over their intercourse with a far greater number. By what means he picked out these few individuals only those conversant with the startling processes of the subconscious memory may say, but the point was that Jones believed the main purpose, if not quite the entire purpose, of his present incarnation lay in his faithful and thorough settling of these accounts, and that if he sought to evade the least detail of such settling, no matter how unpleasant, he would have lived in vain, and would return to his next incarnation with this added duty to perform, for according to his beliefs there was no chance, and could be no ultimate shrinking, and to avoid a problem was merely to waste time and lose opportunities for development. And there was one individual with whom Jones had long understood clearly he had a very large account to settle, and towards the accomplishment of which all the main currents of his being seemed to bear him with unswerving purpose. For when he first entered the insurance office as a junior clerk 10 years before, and through a glass door had caught sight of this man seated in an inner room, one of his sudden, overwhelming flashes of intuitive memory had burst up into him from the depths, and he had seen, as in a flame of blinding light, a symbolical picture of the future rising out of a dreadful past, and he had, with any act of definite volition, marked down this man for a real account to be settled. With that man I shall have much to do, he said to himself, as he noticed the big face look up and meet his eye through the glass. There is something I cannot shirk, a vital relation out of the past of both of us. And he went to his desk, trembling a little, and with shaking knees, as though the memory of some terrible pain had suddenly laid its icy hand upon his heart and touched the scar of a great horror. It was a moment of genuine terror when their eyes had met through the glass door, and he was conscious of an inward shrinking and loathing that seized upon him with great violence, and convinced him, in a single second, that the settling of this account would be almost, perhaps, more than he could manage. The vision passed as swiftly as it came, dropping back again into the submerged region of his consciousness, but he never forgot, and the whole of his life thereafter became a sort of natural though undeliberate preparation for the fulfillment of the great duty when the time should be ripe. In those days, 10 years ago, this man was the assistant manager, but had since been promoted as manager to one of the company's local branches. And soon afterwards, Joan had likewise found himself transferred to the same branch. A little later again, the branch at Liverpool, one of the most important, had been in peril owing to mismanagement and defalcation, and the man had gone to take charge of it, and again, by mere chance apparently, Jones had been promoted to the same place. And this pursuit of the assistant manager had continued for several years, often, too, in the most curious fashion, and though Jones had never exchanged a single word with him, or been so much as noticed indeed by the great man, the clerk understood perfectly well that these moves in the game were all part of a definite purpose. Never for one moment did he doubt that the invisibles behind the veil were slowly and surely arranging the details of it all so as to leap up suitably to the climax demanded by justice, a climax in which himself and the manager would play the leading roles. It is inevitable, he said to himself, and I feel it may be terrible, but when the moment comes I shall be ready, and I pray God that I may face it properly and act like a man. Moreover, as the years passed and nothing happened, he felt the horror closing in upon him with steady increase. For the fact was Jones hated and loathed the manager with an intensity of feeling he had never before experienced towards any human being. He shrank from his presence and from the glance of his eyes, as though he remembered to have suffered nameless cruelties at his hands. And he slowly began to realize, moreover, that the matter to be settled between them was one of very ancient standing, and that the nature of the settlement was a discharge of accumulated punishment, which would probably be very dreadful in the manner of its fulfillment. When therefore the chief cashier one day informed him that the man was to be in London again, this time as general manager of the head office, and said that he was charged to find a private secretary for him from among the best clerks, and further intimated that the selection had fallen upon himself, Jones accepted the promotion quietly, fatalistically, yet with a degree of inward loathing hardly to be described. For he saw in this merely another move in the evolution of the inevitable nemesis which he simply dared not seek to frustrate by any personal consideration, and at the same time he was conscious of a certain feeling of relief that the suspense of waiting might soon be mitigated. A secret sense of satisfaction, therefore, accompanied the unpleasant change, and Jones was able to hold himself perfectly well in hand when it was carried into effect, and he was formally introduced as private secretary to the general manager. Now the manager was a large fat man with a very red face and bags beneath his eyes. Being short-sighted, he wore glasses that seemed to magnify his eyes, which were always a little bloodshot. In hot weather a sort of thin slime covered his cheeks, for he perspired easily. His head was almost entirely bald, and over his turned-down collar his great neck folded into two distinct reddish collops of flesh. His hands were big, and his fingers almost massive in thickness. He was an excellent business man, of sane judgment and firm will, without enough imagination to confuse his course of action by showing him possible alternatives. And his integrity and ability caused him to be held in universal respect by the world of business and finance. In the important regions of a man's character, however, and at heart, he was coarse, brutal, almost to savagery, without consideration for others, and as a result often cruelly unjust to his helpless subordinates. In moments of temper, which were not infrequent, his face turned a dull purple, while the top of his bald head shone by contrast like white marble, and the bags under his eyes swelled till it seemed they would presently explode with a pop. And at these times he presented a distinctly repulsive appearance. But to a private secretary like Jones, who did his duty regardless of whether his employer was a beast or an angel, and whose mainspring was principle and not emotion, this made little difference. Within the narrow limits in which anyone could satisfy such a man, he pleased the general manager, and more than once his piercing intuitive faculty, amounting almost to clairvoyance, assisted the chief in a fashion that served to bring the two closer together than might otherwise have been the case, and caused the man to respect in his assistant a power of which he possessed not even the germ himself. It was a curious relationship that grew up between the two, and the cashier, who enjoyed the credit of having made the selection, profited by it indirectly as much as anyone else. So for some time the work of the office continued normally and very prosperously. John Enderby Jones received a good salary, and in the outward appearance of the two chief characters in this history there was little change noticeable, except that the manager grew fatter and redder, and the secretary observed that his own hair was beginning to show rather grayish at the temples. There were, however, two changes in progress, and they both had to do with Jones, and are important to mention. One was that he began to dream evilly, in the region of deep sleep, where the possibility of significant dreaming first develops itself. He was tormented more and more with vivid scenes and pictures in which a tall, thin man, dark and sinister of countenance, and with bad eyes, was closely associated with himself. Only the setting was that of a past age, with costumes of centuries gone by, and the scenes had to do with dreadful cruelties that could not belong to modern life as he knew it. The other change was also significant, but is not so easy to describe, for he had in fact become aware that some new portion of himself, hitherto unawakened, had stirred slowly into life out of the very depths of his consciousness. This new part of himself amounted almost to another personality, and he never observed its least manifestation without a strange thrill at his heart, for he understood that it had begun to watch the manager. End of Four Weird Tales, The Insanity of Jones, A Study in Reincarnation, Part 1.
The House That Was Not by Elia Wilkinson Peedy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The House That Was Not. Bart Fleming took his bride out to his ranch on the plains when she was but 17 years old, and the two set up housekeeping in 320 acres of corn and rye. Off toward the west there was an unbroken sea of tossing corn at that time of the year when the bride came out, and as her sewing window was on the side of the house which faced the sunset, she passed a good part of each day looking into the great rustling mass, breathing in its succulent odors, and listening to its sibilant melody. It was her picture gallery, her opera, her spectacle, and being sensible, or perhaps being merely happy, she made the most of it. When harvesting time came and the corn was cut, she had much entertainment in discovering what lay beyond. The town was east, and it chanced that she had never ridden west. So when the rolling hills of this newly beholden land lifted themselves for her contemplation, and the harvest sun, all in an angry and sanguinary glow, sank in the veiled horizon, and at noon a scarf of golden vapor wavered up and down along the earth line, it was as if a new world had been made for her. Sometimes at the coming of a storm, a whiplash of purple cloud, full of electric agility, snapped along the western horizon. "Oh, you'll see a lot of queer things on these here plains," her husband said when she spoke to him of these phenomena. "I guess what you see is the wind." "The wind?" cried Flora. "You can't see the wind, Bart." "Now look here, Flora," returned Bart with benevolent emphasis. "You're a smart one, but you don't know all I know about this here country. I've lived here 3 mortal years waiting for you to get up out of your mother's arms and come out to keep me company, and I know what there is to know. Some things out here is queer, so queer folks wouldn't believe them unless they saw, and some so pig-headed they don't believe their own eyes. As for the wind, if you lay down flat and squint toward the west, you can see it blowing along near the ground, like a big ribbon, and sometimes it's the color of air, and sometimes it's silver and gold, and sometimes, when a storm is coming, it's purple. If you got so tired looking at the wind, why didn't you marry some other girl, Bart, instead of waiting for me?" Flora was more interested in the first part of Bart's speech than in the last. "Oh, come on," protested Bart, and he picked her up in his arms and jumped her toward the ceiling of the low shack as if she were a little girl. But then, to be sure, she wasn't much more. Of all the things Flora saw when the corn was cut down, nothing interested her so much as a low cottage, something like her own, which lay away in the distance. She could not guess how far it might be, because distances are deceiving out there, where the altitude is high and the air is as clear as one of those mystic balls of glass in which the sallow mystics of India see the moving shadows of the future. She had not known there were neighbors so near, and she wondered for several days about them before she ventured to say anything to Bart on the subject. Indeed, for some reason which she did not attempt to explain to herself, she felt shy about broaching the matter. Perhaps Bart did not want her to know the people. The thought came to her, as naughty thoughts will come, even to the best of persons, that some handsome young men might be batching it out there by themselves, and Bart didn't wish her to make their acquaintance. Bart had flattered her so much that she had actually begun to think herself beautiful, though as a matter of fact she was only a nice little girl with a lot of reddish-brown hair and a bright pair of reddish-brown eyes and a white face. "Bart," she ventured one evening as the sun, at its fiercest, rushed toward the great black hollow of the west, "who lives over there in that shack?" She turned away from the window where she had been looking at the incarnadined disk, and she thought she saw Bart turn pale. But then her eyes were so blurred with the glory she had been gazing at that she might easily have been mistaken. "I say, Bart, why don't you speak? If there's any one around to associate with, I should think you'd let me have the benefit of their company. It isn't as funny as you think, staying here alone days and days." You ain't getting homesick, be you, sweetheart? Cried Bart, putting his arms around her. You ain't getting tired of my society, be you? It took some time to answer this question in a satisfactory manner, but at length Flora was able to return to her original topic. But the shack, Bart, who lives there anyway? I'm not acquainted with them, said Bart sharply. Ain't them biscuits done, Flora? Then, of course, she grew obstinate. Those biscuits will never be done, Bart, till I know about that house, and why you never spoke of it, and why nobody ever comes down the road from there. Someone lives there, I know, for in the mornings and at night I see the smoke coming out of the chimney. Do you now? Cried Bart, opening his eyes and looking at her with unfeigned interest. Well, do you know, sometimes I've fancied I seen that too. Well, why not? Cried Flora in half anger. Why shouldn't you? See here, Flora, take them biscuits out and listen to me. There ain't no house there. Hello, I didn't know you'd go for to drop the biscuits. Wait, I'll help you pick 'em up. By cracky, they're hot, ain't they? What you putting a towel over 'em for? Well, you set down here on my knees so. Now, you look over at that there house. You see it, don't you? Well, it ain't there. No, I saw it the first week I was out here. I was just half dying thinking of you and wondering why you didn't write. That was the time you was mad at me. So I rode over there one day, looking up company, so to speak, and there wa'n't no house there. I spent all one Sunday looking for it. Then I spoke to Jim Geary about it. He laughed and got a little white about the gills, and he said he guessed I'd have to look a good while before I found it. He said that there shack was an old joke. Why? What? Well, this here's the story he told me. He said a man and his wife came out here to live and put up that there little place. And she was young, you know, and kind of skeery, and she got lonesome. It worked on her and worked on her. One day she up and killed the baby and her husband and herself. The folks found 'em and buried 'em right there on their own ground. Well, about 2 weeks after that, the house was burned down. Don't know how, tramps maybe. Anyhow, it burned. At least I guess it burned. You guess it burned? Well, it ain't there, you know. But if it burned, the ashes are there. All right, girlie, they're there then. Now let's have tea. This they proceeded to do, and were happy and cheerful all evening. But that didn't keep Flora from rising at the first flush of dawn and stealing out of the house. She looked away over the west as she went to the barn, and there, dark and firm against the horizon, stood the little house against the pellucid sky of morning. She got on Ginger's back, Ginger being her own yellow bronco, and set off at a hard pace for the house. It didn't appear to come any nearer, but the objects which had seemed to be beside it came closer into view, and Flora pressed on, with her mind steeled for anything. But as she approached the poplar windbreak which stood to the north of the house, the little shack waned like a shadow before her. It faded and dimmed before her eyes. She slapped Ginger's flanks and kept him going, and she at last got him up to the spot, but there was nothing there. The bunch grass grew tall and rank, and in the midst of it lay a baby's shoe. Flora thought of picking it up, but something cold in her veins withheld her. Then she grew angry and set Ginger's head toward the place and tried to drive him over it. But the yellow bronco gave one snort of fear, gathered himself in a bunch, and then all tense leaping muscles made for home as only a bronco can. End of The House That Was Not by Elia Wilkinson Peedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.